What kind of people emerge from a world where the horizon never ends? There are places on Earth where distance itself becomes a teacher. The Pontic Caspian steppe, stretching from the lower Danube toward the shadow of the Ural Mountains, was once such a world. In the late Bronze Age, long before the Cimmerians rode into the historical record, this landscape spread outward in every direction. A boundless plain of wind-swept grass, pale soil, and sky so wide that dawn and dusk seemed to last forever. Here sound traveled far and movement was life. For those who called this land home, the steppe was not empty. It was immense, alive, and quietly shaping the societies that would one day rise upon it. Winters descended early, laying thin veils of ice across the grasses. Summers arrived suddenly, warm and shimmering, turning the plains into a sea of moving gold. Rain fell in fleeting sheets, and rivers wandered across the land like shallow blue ribbons, altering their courses from generation to generation. In this environment, survival depended less on walls or cities and more on rhythm, the knowledge of when to move, when to graze, and when to wait for the seasons to turn. Long before the Cimmerians, the steppe was home to cultures whose names have survived only through archaeology. Among them were the Srubnaya, the so-called timber-grave peoples, known for burying their dead beneath wooden frameworks set within earthen barrows. These graves, scattered across the plains, are some of our calmest windows into their world. When excavated, they reveal pottery brushed with simple geometric lines, tools shaped from bronze, and the worn remains of harness gear, hints of a life measured by movement and craft. Even before written history touched the steppe, its people were already adapting to a life between stillness and travel, leaving behind graves that quietly mirrored the homes they slept in above the earth. These timber structures served not only as resting places but as echoes of everyday architecture, small, sturdy, and oriented toward the horizon. The Srubnaya and their neighbors raised herds of cattle, sheep, and horses. Pastoralism was not only an economic system but a worldview. To move with the animals was to follow the pulse of the land itself. Each family or clan traced familiar routes across the plains. Summer pastures near higher, breezier ground. Winter camps tucked into river valleys for shelter. These migrations were not chaotic wanderings but carefully repeated circuits learned over generations. Though horses had been domesticated on the steppe for centuries, the late Bronze Age marked a subtle shift. Riding, once rare and limited, slowly became more common. At first, children were likely the most agile riders, sent ahead to guide herds or scout the land. Over time, horseback travel became a quiet revolution. A second calm discovery arises. With a single animal beneath them, steppe peoples could suddenly see farther, move faster, and carry knowledge across distances that once would have taken days. This mobility would eventually give rise to the mounted cultures that transformed Eurasia, but in these early centuries, it simply meant that families could manage their herds more effectively and communicate with distant kin. Archaeologists studying this era often comment on the silence of the steppe, how few permanent structures remain, how rarely stone was used, how little survives except pottery fragments, burial mounds, and the faint outlines of seasonal camps. But this quiet archaeological record reflects a profound truth. In a landscape so vast, permanence was not measured in buildings. It lived instead in memory, in shared ancestry, in the constellations that guided travelers by night. Families carried their stories with them. Songs described the lineages of horses, the behavior of rivers, the moments when winter storms arrived too early or the grass grew too thin. These oral traditions, though lost to time, shaped identities as firmly as any written epic. We can imagine them gathering around low fires, using the glow to warm their hands while reciting the names of ancestors who had crossed the same plains centuries before. As the Bronze Age progressed, climatic changes subtly reshaped the steppe. Some regions grew drier. Others fluctuated between periods of abundance and scarcity. For pastoral societies, these shifts were both challenge and opportunity. A drought in one territory could push families eastward or westward. A sudden burst of rich grass could attract herds from far away. Movement became not only a choice but a necessity of survival. In this way, the steppe acted as a slow, constant sculptor, encouraging the merging, splitting, and reshaping of communities. This era saw increased contact between steppe peoples and their neighbors farther south. In the foothills of the Caucasus, metalworkers crafted intricate bronze weapons and ornaments, trading them northward. In return, steppe clans likely offered livestock, leather goods, and the knowledge of distant routes. Through these exchanges, the broader world began to learn about the inhabitants of the plains, though their own names for themselves are lost, replaced by labels archaeologists assign centuries later. Meanwhile, in the burial mounds of the Srubnaya, signs of social complexity quietly emerged. Some graves contain fine bronze axes or elegantly shaped vessels. Others are humbler. This suggests that leadership existed, but it was likely fluid, tied to age, wisdom, or the ability to guide herds safely through changing seasons. No palaces or large monuments mark this society, yet their way of life endured for centuries, resilient against the storms and droughts that swept the open plains. Another calm discovery becomes clear: the steppe teaches subtlety. Its cultures did not rise through towering architecture but through the mastery of motion, environment, and memory. Their achievements are quieter but no less profound: the domestication of horses, the development of mobile households, and the creation of trade routes that would one day span continents. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, new pressures began to ripple across Eurasia. To the east, early nomadic groups experimented with more extensive riding and the first forms of mounted archery. To the west, migrations in the Balkans and Central Europe reshaped political landscapes. The steppe, always watching, responded. Communities shifted, merged, or disappeared into others. Among these transitions, a new identity began to take form, one rooted in older Srubnaya traditions but distinct enough to be noticed by outsiders in centuries to come. Though we cannot pinpoint the exact moment, the ancestors of the Cimmerians emerged from this slow transformation. Their cultural lineage connected to the late Timbergrave horizon, yet their mobility, weaponry, and social organization would become more dynamic, more suited to rapid movement across the plains. When Assyrian scribes finally wrote of them in the 1st millennium BCE, they described fierce riders from the north, but such descriptions capture only the end of a much older story. For now, in this early chapter, what matters is the land that shaped them. A land where wind served as an ever-present companion, where horses learned to sense storms hours before they appeared, where the sun set in great sheets of color across an uninterrupted horizon. These experiences wove themselves into the identity of every steppe child. They learned early that space was both protection and vulnerability, that distance could be crossed but not conquered. And so, before the Cimmerians ever rode into foreign chronicles, their world had already prepared them, not through kings or cities, but through the quiet teachings of grass, sky, and the unending line of the horizon. As generations moved with their herds and the winds, new peoples emerged from these older traditions. Among them, the ancestors of those we would come to call the Cimmerians. How does a scattered landscape of tribes become a people known across continents? Across the wide expanse of the steppe, identity did not appear suddenly. It gathered slowly, like the quiet accumulation of wind-shaped dunes or the seasonal movement of herds across familiar routes. In the centuries following the Late Bronze Age, the cultures of the Pontic Caspian steppe experienced a transformation not defined by conquest or monumental architecture, but by a gradual shift in technology, ritual, and the subtle ways people understood themselves. These changes laid the foundations for what would become the mounted nomadism of the early Iron Age, the world into which the Cimmerians would soon emerge. In this early period, movement was still guided primarily by pasture and weather. Families walked beside cattle and sheep, driving them to fresh grazing grounds, while their horses served as helpers rather than central icons. But the seeds of something new were beginning to take root. Small innovations, unnoticed at first, began to shape how people traveled, fought, and remembered. These quiet developments not only transformed daily life but steadily molded a new cultural landscape. One of the earliest signs of this shift can be found in the changing design of horse bridles. Archaeologists tracing the evolution of cheek pieces, bits, and harness ornaments observe a steady improvement in control. Early bridles were simple affairs, often carved from bone or antler, allowing only limited direction. But over time, more refined pieces appeared, slotted cheek plates, bronze bits, and symmetrical designs that show a growing appreciation for precision. A calm discovery takes shape here. The more easily a rider could guide a horse, the more confidently they could move across the landscape, opening the door to a lifestyle where distance became less of an obstacle and more of an invitation. These developments spread through cultural exchange rather than centralized authority. The steppe had no capitals and few permanent settlements, yet ideas flowed freely. A new type of bridle, a sharper blade, or an ornate belt fitting could move hundreds of kilometers as families traded, intermarried, or crossed paths during seasonal migrations. Through these gentle interactions, a shared technological vocabulary began to form, not uniform, but recognizable, binding communities that once seemed wholly scattered. At the same time, another innovation quietly changed the steppe world: the refinement of the composite bow. Built from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it required skill to construct but offered remarkable power in a small frame. It could be fired from horseback long before mounted archery became widespread. In the hands of early steppe hunters, it allowed for more agile pursuits of deer and antelope, and later more flexible tactics in conflict. Though the composite bow is often associated with the great nomadic confederations of later centuries, the Scythians, Sarmatians, and Huns, its roots stretch back to these formative generations. Its presence in graves and scattered settlements suggests a growing appreciation for mobility in combat. Warriors no longer had to stand firm in tight formations. They could move, flank, retreat, and respond to threats with a fluidity that mirrored the steppe itself. The idea of the mounted warrior, however, did not arise fully formed. In the transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age, the chariot still held symbolic and practical weight. Even as riding increased, chariots remained prestigious objects, appearing in burial traditions across the steppe and beyond. Some graves contain the wheels and frames of light vehicles, buried alongside harness fittings, weapons, and offerings for the afterlife. These chariot burials reveal not only the importance of status but also the deep connection between mobility and identity. The chariot served as a bridge, a memory of the older Bronze Age world and a precursor to the horse-mounted future. As the steppe societies shifted, they carried elements of both worlds with them. The chariot's presence in ritual contexts suggests that mobility itself had become sacred, intertwined with ideas of leadership, protection, and the journey between life and death. Another window into steppe identity lies in its iconography. Carved stele ornaments and small bronze plaques begin to depict warriors armed with spears, axes, and occasionally bows. Some show stylized horses, their manes flowing, their bodies elongated to emphasize speed. Others depict figures in dynamic poses, suggesting a culture increasingly comfortable with depicting strength, motion, and personal prowess. These images were not propaganda. They were quiet affirmations of value: the importance of courage, the bond between human and animal, and the respect given to those who protected their communities. Such iconography hints at a growing martial ethos, one that would eventually be associated with groups like the Cimmerians, Scythians, and Sarmatians, though each would express it differently. Meanwhile, the greater world beyond the steppe was changing. The collapse of long-standing Bronze Age civilizations, from the Mycenaeans to the Hittites, disrupted regional networks across Europe and the Near East. Trade routes fractured. Old powers weakened. The vacuum left behind created room for new societies to rise, particularly those who could move quickly, adapt to new landscapes, and seize opportunities across wide territories. The steppe peoples did not invade these spaces at this stage, but their mobility made them natural inheritors of shifting frontiers. As southern kingdoms faltered, steppe clans found themselves connected to regions they once only skirted. Through trade, seasonal travel, or exploratory forays, they began to engage with lands that would later feature prominently in their histories. This slow expansion also brought cultural and linguistic diversity. The steppe was never home to a single homogeneous population. Instead, it held a mosaic of Indo-European languages, local dialects, and cultural hybrids. The question of the Cimmerians' linguistic identity, Iranian, Thracian, or a mixture, reflects this very mosaic. Ancient authors left only fragmentary clues, and modern scholars disagree, not because the evidence is unclear, but because the steppe world was fluid. Languages blended along migration routes. Cultural traits overlapped. Names shifted as outsiders tried to categorize groups who rarely left textual records of their own. Here, calm clarity is essential. Whether the Cimmerians spoke an Iranian dialect, a Thracian-related tongue, or something between, they emerged from a multilingual world where identity was shaped as much by shared practices as by speech. Rituals, mobility, warfare, and social memory mattered as deeply as vocabulary. As new technologies spread, ironworking, refined riding gear, improved bows, the communities of the late Bronze Age steppe grew increasingly connected. Distance became less daunting. Alliances formed between clans during hard winters. Pastoral routes were adjusted to avoid overgrazing. Conflicts arose and receded as resources shifted. Amid these patterns, a new kind of social flexibility developed. Leaders were valued for their ability to guide migrations, negotiate with neighbors, and maintain harmony across dispersed families. This fluid leadership style would become characteristic of many steppe societies. It stood in contrast to the rigid hierarchies of palace-based kingdoms to the south. Authority on the steppe was earned through wisdom, skill, and the delicate balance between independence and cooperation. It was a system perfectly suited to a mobile world, one that nurtured resilience and adaptability. As these cultural seeds matured, the steppe gradually entered the early Iron Age. The introduction of iron tools and weapons did not immediately transform society, but it added durability to daily life. Iron knives, spearheads, and axes became more common. Herding equipment improved. By the time the first writers of the ancient Near East encountered steppe groups, they described people skilled in horsemanship, armed with powerful bows, and capable of swift, unpredictable movement. In this landscape of emerging identities, the ancestors of the Cimmerians began to coalesce. Their culture was not a sudden invention but a continuation, an inheritance from centuries of technological refinement, ritual significance, and the quiet shaping of the land itself. They were part of the broader tapestry of early nomadic peoples, yet distinct enough that neighboring civilizations recognized them as a unique force. Their story, however, was still forming. Before the storms of history recorded their migrations and wars, the Cimmerians lived in the rhythms of the steppe, tending herds, honoring ancestors, refining their tools, and adapting to a changing world. And through these calm, persistent developments, they built the foundations of a society capable of remarkable mobility and influence. And as the steppe changed, so too did the people, preparing for the moment when history would finally speak their name. How do we tell the story of a people who left few words, but countless traces in the soil? Before the Cimmerians thundered into the records of kings, before their riders crossed the passes of Anatolia or clashed with the fortified realms of the Near East, they appeared as something much smaller, a faint outline, a suggestion, a whisper at the edge of ancient memory. For most civilizations, history begins with inscription or script, a ruler speaking through stone, a scribe pressed over clay. But for the Cimmerians, the story begins not with language, but with landscape and movement. Nomadic societies often leave little written testimony of their own. Their monuments are the routes they traveled, the pastures they chose, the burial mounds rising from the grasslands. To understand a people like the Cimmerians, one must step into the quiet spaces between written lines, listening not to chronicles, but to the traces scattered across the steppe. The earliest historical hint of the Cimmerians comes from the Assyrian world, where scribes chronicled the challenges faced by their northern frontiers. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire reached its greatest power, yet its scholars remained wary of shifting forces beyond the Caucasus. Among these distant peoples, they mention a group called the Cimmeri, a name that scholars widely associate with the Cimmerians. These references describe a people unsettled, moving, and occasionally violent, but still distant enough to feel more like rumor than reality. A calm discovery unfolds here. For the first time, the Cimmerians step from invisibility into the vision of a literate power, not as subjects or partners, but as a horizon approaching. The Assyrians did not attempt to describe their culture. Instead, they marked their presence as a phenomenon, a movement of northern tribes, restless and unpredictable, pushing toward the regions south of the Caucasus. Their words reflect unease, not detailed knowledge, hinting that the Cimmerians were still beyond settled diplomatic boundaries. They were known through scouts, border observations, and the stories of those who lived along the empire's edges. In later centuries, Greek writers like Herodotus, Strabo, and others would offer their own interpretations. But these accounts were shaped by hindsight, written long after the Cimmerian migrations had settled into legend. To the Greeks, the Cimmerians were a shadowed people, an ancestral presence that once haunted the northern shores of the Black Sea. Some saw them as predecessors of the Scythians. Others placed them in mythic geographies, associating them with fog-shrouded lands and distant horizons. Yet even within the poetic vagueness of Greek recollection, a faint coherence appears. They remembered the Cimmerians as wanderers displaced by stronger powers, pushed southward in a wave of upheaval. While the details remained clouded, the impression endured, a people in motion, caught in the great rhythmic migrations of the steppe. Between the Assyrian anxieties and Greek reflections, a silence stretches, the silence of the Cimmerians' own unwritten voice. But beneath that silence lies another form of evidence, one etched not on clay tablets but into soil, metal, bone, and the alignment of ancient graves. Archaeologists approach the Cimmerians as one might approach a constellation. The stars are real, but the shapes connecting them must be traced with care. The northern and eastern shores of the Black Sea, between the Caucasus and the lower Dnieper, hold material traditions that shift during the early Iron Age. Changes in burial practices, metalwork styles, and equestrian gear suggest the presence of groups who match the chronological and geographical profile of the people ancient sources called Cimmerians. One of the most revealing elements is the kurgan, the earthen burial mound that served both as a resting place for the dead and a marker of lineage. Kurgans of the early Iron Age show a transition from earlier Bronze Age cultures to a style that foreshadows the Scythians. Some contain weapons, horse gear, and ornaments that blend older traditions with emerging steppe innovations. In these graves, researchers see a cultural bridge, a people standing between two worlds. The Cimmerians occupy the threshold between Bronze Age steppe societies and the later, fully developed nomadic cultures that would dominate Eurasia. Their material culture reflects continuity rather than rupture. Bronze ornaments alongside early iron tools, modest horse equipment paired with older ritual forms. They were not yet the mounted archers of classical antiquity, but their identity was clearly shaped by growing mobility and the increasing significance of the horse. Metalwork offers another quiet clue. Distinctive Cimmerian-type spearheads, often long and socketed, appear across regions associated with early mentions of the group. Their distribution mirrors the path that historical sources suggest, from the north of the Black Sea, curving along the Caucasus, and eventually stretching into Anatolia. These spearheads are not proof of ethnicity, but they signal a chain of influence that aligns with recorded migrations. Similarly, the evolution of horse gear provides insight. Bits, gags, and cheek plates found in early Iron Age contexts around the northwestern Caucasus show a transitional phase between older timbergrave cultures and the more ornate Scythian styles that would flourish later. The Cimmerians likely lived during this transitional era, shaping and being shaped by these developments. Yet for all the material hints, one defining feature remains elusive: the Cimmerians' own sense of who they were. Names recorded by outsiders rarely capture internal identity. A people may have called themselves by one name, only for neighbors to apply another. The Cimmerians, like many nomadic societies, likely understood themselves through kinship ties, clan relationships, and oral traditions rather than a unified political identity. This subtle truth echoes across the steppe. Nomadic identity is fluid, defined by relationships, landscapes, and shared practices rather than fixed boundaries. For the Cimmerians, belonging may have meant moving with particular herds, honoring specific ancestors, or maintaining customary burial rites. Such patterns can be observed archaeologically, though they must be interpreted with humility. The question of language adds another layer of quiet complexity. Scholars debate whether the Cimmerians were Indo-Iranian, Thracian, or culturally mixed. Ancient authors provided only a few names, insufficient for definite linguistic classification. The archaeological record suggests cultural overlap with early Iranian-speaking groups, yet certain burial traits and geographic patterns also align with populations further west. The Cimmerians were likely part of the multilingual fabric of the early steppe, a world where language boundaries were porous, shaped by migration, intermarriage, and shared lifeways. Rather than forcing a single identity, it is more faithful to see them as a product of diverse influences that converged across the northern Black Sea world. As the early Iron Age progressed, movements intensified. Evidence around the Caucasus, fortifications, disrupted settlements, new layers of imported objects, suggest pressures building along the frontier. Some groups pushed southward into Transcaucasia, others shifted west or remained along traditional routes. Ancient authors later remembered the Cimmerians as being displaced by rising Scythian power, and archaeology hints that this memory may hold truth. Changes in kurgan distributions, weapon styles, and settlement patterns point toward significant upheaval in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Yet even this displacement was not a single event. It unfolded slowly, across seasons and generations, as alliances changed and landscapes shifted. Families likely moved in waves rather than as a unified horde. Some adapted, some resisted, some integrated with neighbors. Through these movements, the Cimmerians became more visible to the empires watching from the south, first as an approaching presence, then as a force capable of reshaping regional politics. By the time the Cimmerians entered the firm light of historical records, they had already lived centuries of quiet evolution. The whisper that first reached Assyrian scribes would soon become a clearer sound. Raids across borders, alliances with local kingdoms, and a dramatic entrance into the stories of Lydia, Phrygia, and Urartu. But in these early hints, these scattered traces, we glimpse their humanity more gently than the later chronicles allow. They were herders and riders, protectors of kin, custodians of ancient traditions. They shaped metal with practiced hands. They laid their dead beneath the rising mounds. They listened to the shifting winds of the steppe and responded with movement, resilience, and adaptability. Long before empires wrote their name, the Cimmerians had already written themselves into the landscape. With the first traces identified, the journey of the Cimmerians moves from obscurity into motion, toward the first great migrations. When does a collection of clans begin to think of itself as one people? As their identity strengthened, forces were already rising beyond the horizon, pushing the Cimmerians into movement. When does a collection of clans begin to think of itself as one people? In the quiet expanse of the early Iron Age, long before their name echoed through Assyrian tablets or Greek epics, the ancestors of the Cimmerians were simply scattered families on the move, drifting across river valleys, mountain foothills, and rolling grasslands. They had no borders, no capital, no written records. What held them together was not a kingdom, but a rhythm. The rhythm of hooves, the sweep of migrations, the memories carried through generations, and the slow weaving of shared customs that would, over time, become unmistakably Cimmerian. In this early world, identity was not a proclamation but a gradual settling of patterns. Children were raised hearing the same kinds of stories. Warriors crafted and carried weapons with familiar shapes. Elders buried their dead with consistent rituals, each one reinforcing a sense that these clans, though dispersed and often distant, belonged to a larger tapestry. This was not a people formed by decree, but by tradition. Archaeology gives us only fragments, yet the fragments speak gently. Across the northern Black Sea region and the fringes of the Caucasus, Early burials reveal a cultural kinship. Bodies laid to rest in stone-lined chambers, covered in earthen mounds, accompanied by weapons, bronze ornaments, and sometimes the remains of beloved horses. Such rites were not unique to one tribe. They spread across communities that interacted, intermarried, traded, and followed similar seasonal paths. Through these rituals, a shared worldview emerged, one that placed honor, mobility, and ancestral continuity at the center of life. To understand the Cimmerians at this formative stage, we must imagine not a single tribe but a web of clans. Each clan had its own leaders, storytellers, and horsemasters. Yet they lived in a landscape that encouraged cooperation. Pasturelands shifted with the seasons. Rivers offered routes of travel. Threats, whether rival nomads, harsh winters, or territorial mountain groups, demanded alliances. Over time, alliances hardened into traditions, and traditions into identity. One of the strongest threads binding these early Cimmerian communities was their relationship with horses. Long before their riders would thunder into Anatolia or clash with Assyrian armies, the Cimmerians lived in intimate partnership with their herds. Horses provided movement, survival, and spiritual meaning. Young warriors trained from childhood, learning to ride bareback, to fire arrows from a full gallop, to feel the earth through the stride of an animal that was both companion and symbol. Many early burial mounds include horse gear, bronze cheek pieces, decorated bridle parts, and distinctive bit styles, all hinting at a shared tradition of horsemanship that extended across clan boundaries. Oral traditions grew around these practices. No written Cimmerian mythology survives, but scholars infer echoes of their stories from later Scythian and Indo-European parallels. Tales of sky gods, war deities, ancestral riders guiding the souls of the dead, and spirits that lived in mountains and storms. Around fires, in tents made of leather and felt, elders recited genealogies stretching back centuries. These stories were how clans remembered themselves. And as stories merged, so did identities. Craftsmanship offers another window. Early Cimmerian metalworkers showed a distinctive aesthetic, one that blended local traditions with influences carried by long-distance connections. Their bronze daggers, arrowheads, belt plaques, and horse trappings reveal motifs that would later flourish among the Scythians. Stylized animals, coiled bodies, spirals, and fluid designs that suggested movement even when cast in metal. Such artistry, spread across different communities, became a quiet language of belonging. If two travelers met on the steppe and recognized the familiar arc of a bronze ornament or the curve of a blade, they understood that they came from related worlds. But a unifying identity is never built solely on objects. It is built on interactions. Clans that once traveled separately began to share wintering grounds. They gathered at river crossings where herders exchanged goods, warriors arranged marriages across groups, and shamans performed rituals that invoked protection over all who participated. These gatherings served as the social glue of early nomadic life. Through them, disputes could be settled, alliances renewed, and communal decisions made. Decisions that affected not just one clan, but many. This period, though peaceful in tone, was not without tension. The early Cimmerians lived at a crossroads. To their north stretched vast grasslands. To their south loomed the Caucasus Mountains, home to agricultural communities, fortified settlements, and distinct cultural groups. Trade routes ran through this region like threads sewn through cloth, bringing goods from far-off lands. Metal from the Urartians, textiles from Anatolia, ornaments from the Near East. Such exchanges brought wealth but also exposure. The clans who would become the Cimmerians learned to adapt to new neighbors, new ideas, and new pressures. Yet even as influences shifted, certain traditions persisted and became markers of identity. Burial customs, horse gear designs, warrior rituals, these endured. Through them, we glimpse the quiet merging of clans into a people. No single moment created the Cimmerians, no singular event or founding hero. Their identity grew slowly, like a river carving its path, shaped by countless small choices, shared environments, and mutual dependencies. Fluidity was their strength. Unlike states with rigid hierarchies, the early Cimmerians could absorb families, adopt new customs, and adapt to changing landscapes without losing their core traditions. This flexibility created a resilient culture, one capable of expanding, shifting, and responding to the pressures that would soon come from all directions. And while archaeology provides the physical evidence of this emerging identity, the emotional reality is easier to imagine. Picture a young rider watching the sun rise over the plains, hearing the familiar ring of a bronze buckle at their side. Picture a clan gathering at dusk, sharing stories of raids, hunts, and migrations, each family contributing a piece of a shared past. Picture generations who walked the same paths, tended herds on the same grasslands, and laid their dead in the same style of graves. Over time, such continuity weaves a sense of belonging more powerful than any written declaration. By the end of this formative era, the Cimmerians were not merely a collection of clans, they were a confederation. A loose but recognizable network, united by customs, mobility, and kinship ties. They were ready, though they did not yet know it, for the upheavals that would soon reshape their world. For beyond the horizon, pressures were beginning to rise. Climate shifts, rival nomads, and the early movements of the Scythians would soon send shockwaves across the steppe. These forces would push the Cimmerian Confederation into motion and into history. With their identity strengthened, forces were already rising beyond the horizon, pushing the Cimmerians into movement. What happens to a nomadic people when another nomadic power rises behind them? And so, driven by pressure and opportunity, the Cimmerians rode south, toward the mountains that would define their destiny. What happens to a nomadic people when another nomadic power rises behind them? On the great sweep of the Eurasian steppe, where horizons roll unbroken and the sky feels impossibly vast, change often arrives without warning. It can come not from storms or famine, but from the distant echo of hooves, the approach of another wandering people whose movements ripple outward like waves across the grasslands. For the early Cimmerians, these ripples came from the east, carried by the emergence of a new force, the Scythians. The Scythians did not appear suddenly, nor did they descend as invaders in a single climactic event. Instead, their rise was gradual and complex, shaped by generations of movement, adaptation, and pressure further east. As early steppe cultures reorganized, competed, and migrated, the Scythians expanded westward, bringing with them a dynamic form of nomadic life, one that emphasized mobility, archery, and a distinctive artistic and spiritual tradition. Their arrival on the Pontic steppe created a shifting landscape where older communities, including the Cimmerians, had to navigate new realities. Archaeology captures the quiet traces of this transition. Burial sites once dominated by Cimmerian-style mounds begin to show subtle changes. Different arrowhead designs, new forms of bronze horse gear, and the first signs of the famous Scythian animal-style art, dynamic depictions of deer, rams, and predators whose bodies curl into flowing motion. These cultural signatures do not replace the older forms instantly. Instead, they intermingle, overlap, and slowly transform the archaeological record, like brushstrokes blending on a canvas. But change on the steppe is not only cultural, it is physical. In certain regions, burned horizons appear in settlements and campsites, thin layers of ash marking destruction. Some scholars interpret these as signs of conflict, perhaps raids or battles as Scythian groups pushed into territories previously used by Cimmerian clans. Yet even here, the evidence whispers rather than shouts. The fires might reflect confrontation, or they might reflect the instability of a region where multiple peoples competed for the same grazing lands. On the steppe, conflict and movement are often intertwined, and archaeology leaves only fragments of their stories. What becomes clearer is that patterns of life shifted. Older Cimmerian burial grounds begin to thin, while new ones appear farther to the west and south. The styles of weapons found in these graves also evolve. Early Cimmerian daggers and arrowheads give way to designs more suited to the fast-moving, highly mobile style of warfare associated with Scythian archery. These changes suggest a time of adaptation, displacement, and response, not the collapse of a people but their transformation under pressure. It is important to understand that the Cimmerians and Scythians were not opposites. They shared broad cultural roots. Both were horse-riding, pastoral nomadic societies who valued mobility, skill in battle, and kinship bonds. Both buried their dead beneath earth mounds, used bronze and iron tools, and relied on oral traditions for memory and identity. Their lifeways overlapped, their rituals resonated, and their histories interlaced across generations. But they were not the same. Scythian groups seemed to have organized themselves with a different internal structure, one that allowed for rapid expansion and the projection of power across large distances. Their mastery of mounted archery, their widespread use of composite bows, and their distinctive aristocratic warrior culture gave them a momentum that reshaped the Pontic world. Their arrival placed pressure on older confederations, and in this shifting environment, the Cimmerians became a people in motion. Imagine the experience of a Cimmerian clan during this time. At first, distant riders appear on the eastern horizon, scouts from a group not yet known but not yet feared. Months later, more riders arrive, moving with a confidence that suggests both skill and intention. Pasturelands that once stretched empty for days now hold newcomers grazing their herds. River crossings become contested. Old wintering grounds, once shared peacefully between local clans, grow crowded. And though the Cimmerians had long embraced mobility, there is a difference between choosing when to move and being forced to move. Some clans may have resisted. Some may have exchanged goods and intermarried with early Scythian groups. Others may have simply followed the natural push of larger population movements, traveling season by season into new territories. Nomadic history is rarely a simple narrative of victory and retreat. It is a mosaic of interactions: cooperation, conflict, competition, and exchange. But through these interactions, one pattern becomes clear: the Cimmerian center of gravity shifted. Archaeologists describe this as the moment when the Cimmerians transition from a largely regional culture to a migratory historical force. Their burial sites move from the North Caucasus steppe toward the southern edges of the mountains. Their metalwork adapts. Their travel routes lengthen. Their relationship with the land becomes less tied to fixed wintering grounds and more defined by movement itself. In this transformation, two identities coexist. The Cimmerians remain themselves, shaped by their ancestral rituals, their shared traditions, their confederation of clans. Yet they also become more fluid, more dynamic, more prepared for the journeys that lie ahead. A people who once traveled within familiar territories now carry their world with them entirely. Their tents, their tools, their herds, and their memories. They become, in the fullest sense, a people on horseback. This shift is echoed in the stories later told by Greek writers, who describe the Cimmerians as restless wanderers, forced ever onward by stronger nomads behind them. These accounts blend history with myth, but beneath their poetic embellishments lies a simple truth. The Cimmerians lived in a world where motion was survival, and so the landscape of their lives changed. Old boundaries dissolved. Routes that once circled the northern Black Sea began drifting southward. The foothills of the Caucasus, rugged, forested, and rich with passes, became familiar ground. Here, the Cimmerians found both refuge and opportunity. The mountains offered protection from the steppe's shifting power dynamics, but they also offered new paths, routes into Anatolia, into the kingdoms of Urartu, and eventually into the lands of Assyria. In these early migrations, we witness the beginning of the Cimmerians' historical story, the part that will soon be recorded in the chronicles of great empires. But at this moment, their world is still defined by subtle pressures and quiet decisions. They move not out of desperation, but out of necessity. They carry their culture with them not as relics, but as living traditions adapting to new realities. The rise of the Scythians did not erase the Cimmerians. Instead, it reshaped them. It pushed them into the currents of broader history, where they would soon leave marks far deeper than those seen in the archaeological layers of the steppe. And so, driven by pressure and opportunity, the Cimmerians rode south, toward the mountains that would define their destiny. What does it feel like to ride from an open steppe into mountains that touch the clouds? Their arrival in the Near East would soon be felt by kings, cities, and empires, beginning the Cimmerians' most visible era. What does it feel like to ride from an open steppe into mountains that touch the clouds? For generations, the Cimmerians had lived in a world shaped by sky and grass, a landscape without walls, without forests thick enough to interrupt the wind, without ridges blocking the sun's slow arc across the horizon. The Pontic Caspian steppe was a place of movement rather than boundaries. But as pressures and opportunities accumulated behind them, the Cimmerians turned their gaze southward, toward the rising silhouettes of the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus is not a single barrier but a labyrinth of passages, valleys, and rugged uplands stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian. Snow-fed streams wind through deep gorges. Forests cling to steep slopes. Peaks glow silver in the early morning light, their summits wrapped in cloud. To steppe peoples accustomed to level plains, these mountains must have appeared both daunting and wondrous, a realm where the world seemed to fold into itself. Yet the Cimmerians were not strangers to challenge. Their lifestyles had taught them to adapt to climate, to terrain, and to shifting centers of power. And the Caucasus, for all its height and complexity, offered familiar possibilities. For centuries, nomads had used the passes here as seasonal routes, connecting the northern grasslands with the ancient kingdoms and fertile valleys of the Near East. The Cimmerians followed these age-old paths, their herds moving carefully along trails carved by countless migrations before them. As they approached the first foothills, the rhythm of their journey changed. The wind, once sweeping unhindered across the plains, became caught among ridges and trees, creating pockets of stillness. The sound of hooves on hard-packed soil softened as the ground shifted to forest earth and mountain stone. Nights grew colder, sharper, filled with the scent of pine and the distant calls of animals that did not roam the steppe. These sensory changes marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where geography would shape destiny. Archaeological traces suggest that the Cimmerians used a combination of major passes: the Darial Gorge winding between towering cliffs, the Caspian Gates near Derbent, where a narrow coastal corridor links north and south, and perhaps smaller, more hidden routes known only to local tribes. These pathways were not easy. They demanded careful movement, patience, and cooperation. Wagons had to be guided along steep inclines. Horses needed sure footing on rocky ground. Families traveled in close-knit groups, watching the mountains as if studying an unfamiliar language. Upper mountain tribes, ancestors of later groups such as the Caucasian Iberians, Colchians, and various highland communities, encountered the Cimmerians during these early passages. These interactions likely varied. Some peaceful, others wary, many perhaps brief and transactional. Highlanders had long experience dealing with travelers from the steppe. They understood that nomads, though unfamiliar with the mountain environment, carried valuable skills: metalwork, horses bred for endurance, and goods from distant regions. In return, Highlanders offered local knowledge, foodstuffs, and the wisdom of the terrain. Through quiet exchanges, the Cimmerians learned which valleys held reliable grazing, which rivers could be crossed, and which paths were safest during winter. Here we encounter one of the calm discoveries that enrich this part of the story. Despite centuries-old portrayals of nomads as destructive wanderers, evidence suggests that early Cimmerian movement through the Caucasus involved significant cooperation with local communities, a blending of necessity and diplomacy. The mountains themselves act as reminders that survival depends on understanding, not conquest. Even powerful steppe warriors could not impose their will on steep cliffs or unpredictable weather. Instead, they navigated the Caucasus with humility, learning its rhythms as they had once learned the seasonal patterns of the grasslands. As the Cimmerians advanced through the southern exits of the mountains, the world began to open once more, but differently than before. Instead of the vast, treeless plains, they encountered landscapes carved by rivers, dotted with agricultural villages, and guarded by fortified settlements. They had reached the northern borders of the Kingdom of Urartu, one of the Near East's rising regional powers. Urartu was a land of mountains and lakes, with stone fortresses perched atop volcanic ridges and roads connecting distant valleys. Its kings commanded skilled infantry, chariot forces, and elaborate irrigation networks. Compared to the open steppe, this was a world defined by engineering and territory, a place where the land was shaped by human hands as much as by nature. For the Cimmerians, entering such a region must have felt like stepping into a different kind of history. Yet even here they found familiar patterns. Frontiers are always porous, and the northern edges of Urartu were accustomed to interactions with various steppe peoples. Traders, raiders, and migrant groups had passed through these areas for generations. The arrival of the Cimmerians added to this long continuum. Their initial encounters may not have been overtly hostile. Some Cimmerian groups likely traded horses, hides, or metalwork for grain, wine, or crafted goods. Others may have skirted around Eurasian control entirely, moving westward into the lands of the Phrygians and other Anatolian peoples. But tension was inevitable. The Cimmerians were numerous, mobile, and searching for new pastures. Their presence created uncertainty in regions where kingdoms depended on stable borders. Eurasian records, though fragmentary, mention movements of northern peoples during this period, groups whose descriptions align with the early Cimmerians. These reports speak of raids, skirmishes, and shifts in local alliances. They also reveal that the Cimmerians were not a single invading army but a constellation of clans and confederations, each moving along slightly different routes and responding to local conditions in their own way. One of the calm insights hidden in this stage of history is this. The Cimmerian migration was not a dramatic charge into the south but a gradual unfolding. A series of movements, settlements, withdrawals, and negotiations spanning multiple generations. In this sense, their passage through the Caucasus resembles the slow, persistent flow of a river carving through stone. It is not sudden force, but steady presence that reshapes the world around it. As they journey deeper into the Near East, the Cimmerians also reshape themselves. Mountain landscapes encourage different forms of travel, different diets, different shelters. They learned to navigate narrow valleys rather than sweeping plains. They encountered new gods worshipped in highland sanctuaries and exchanged ideas with peoples who spoke unfamiliar languages. Though their core identity remained rooted in the steppe, their experience broadened. The Cimmerians who emerged from the southern slopes of the Caucasus were no longer the same communities who had once lived beside the northern Black Sea. By the time they entered eastern Anatolia, their world had expanded. They stood at the threshold of kingdoms that wrote treaties on clay tablets, that carved inscriptions into stone, and that preserved their histories in fortress archives. Soon, the Cimmerians themselves would appear in these records, no longer silent shadows, but named actors in the dramas of empires. Their first major confrontations came not from deliberate aggression, but from the friction of contact, grazing conflicts, retaliatory raids, and shifting alliances among local powers. Some Cimmerian groups entered the service of Near Eastern kings as mercenaries, valued for their horsemanship and archery. Others operated more independently, testing borders and seizing opportunities as they arose. In all cases, their arrival altered the political landscape of the region. The Cimmerians had completed a journey that few steppe peoples attempted on such a scale. From the deep open grasslands, over some of the most formidable mountains in Eurasia, into the intricate patchwork of Near Eastern civilizations. And with this crossing, they stepped into the full light of recorded history. Their arrival in the Near East would soon be felt by kings, cities, and empires, beginning the Cimmerians' most visible era. How does an empire respond when riders it never expected appear at its gates? From Urartu, their path curved westward, toward the wealthy lands of Anatolia. How does an empire respond when riders it never expected appear at its gates? This is the question quietly embedded in the earliest encounters between the Cimmerians and the kingdom of Urartu. It is a moment in history that feels almost like two worlds discovering one another, not through diplomacy or merchants, but through movement, proximity, and the unpredictable logic of the steppe. By the late 8th century BCE, Urartu stood as one of the most formidable mountain kingdoms of the Near East. Centered around the rugged landscapes of the Armenian highlands, its citadels rose like islands of stone above valleys lined with orchards, terraced fields, and irrigation canals. Fortresses such as Tushpa, Erebuni, and Argesh-Tihanili watched over the kingdom's borders. Their massive basalt walls built to withstand the armies of Assyria, the long-standing rival to the south. Urartu was prepared for the threats it understood: sieges, infantry assaults, chariot warfare, and political intrigue. But the Cimmerians represented something different. A danger that came not on roads or in marching formations, but from the open north, from the direction of the limitless steppe where no fixed borders existed. The Cimmerians who descended into Urartian territory were not a single warband. They were the crest of a long movement, shaped by decades of pressure from the Scythians and drawn toward the opportunities of the Near East. Some arrived slowly in clusters of families and herds. Others came as mounted groups seeking winter pasture or trade. A few, however, the ones that would be remembered, arrived with the practiced mobility of steppe warriors. Urartu's scribes began to note their presence in brief entries, always with an undercurrent of concern. These northern riders did not travel like the enemies Urartu knew. They did not gather in large battalions. They did not send emissaries declaring intention. Instead, they appeared like shifting silhouettes on distant ridges, swift, scattered, yet coordinated when necessary. Their movements were fluid, directed by opportunity rather than oversight. To the settled highland world, this mobility seemed unpredictable. But to the Cimmerians, it was simply life, a mode of existence shaped by terrain, tradition, and long familiarity with the rhythms of horses. When the first clashes occurred, they were likely small. Skirmishes near frontier villages, raids on isolated storehouses, or confrontations with border patrols. Urartian soldiers were heavily armored, trained for close combat and defense of fortifications. The Cimmerians, by contrast, relied on swift movement, light gear, and the bow as their principal weapon. A calm discovery emerges here, one that softens the image of warfare into something more analytical and reflective. The Cimmerians did not fight to conquer Urartu. They fought to access space, pastures, corridors, and opportunities. Their conflicts were shaped less by ideology than by geography. These early attacks were not campaigns. They were tests. The Cimmerians would probe a settlement's defenses, withdraw before reinforcements arrived, and reappear elsewhere days later. Their aim was not to hold territory, but to unsettle the borderlands enough to pass through or to gather provisions. Urartian chroniclers describe enemies who moved like the wind across the mountains. To Urartu, this must have felt deeply unfamiliar, a challenge less of force than of navigation and anticipation. Urartu's king at the time, either Rusa I or his successor, would have faced a dilemma. The mountains gave Urartu strength against conventional armies, but they also limited its visibility and response time. Messages moved slowly across the jagged terrain. Garrisons could defend a stronghold but struggled to pursue fast-moving riders. The Cimmerians exploited this limitation without brutality or spectacle. Their pressure was quiet and constant, a reminder that the northern frontier no longer behaved as it once had. In certain regions, particularly the Ararat Plain and the upper tributaries of the Euphrates, local populations may have formed temporary alliances with the newcomers, offering information or supplies in exchange for protection or horses. Nomadic, settled interaction often exists on a spectrum. Part conflict, part exchange, part adaptation. The Cimmerians were not simply raiders. They were participants in a changing regional system, finding footholds where older powers showed strain. At some point, likely in the late 8th century BCE, scattered confrontations deepened into a more significant clash. The exact details are lost, but archaeological evidence from burned fortifications near the northern borders suggests that one or more Cimmerian groups launched a coordinated attack. Whether they were acting independently or responding to pressure from the Scythians behind them, the result was unmistakable. Urartu took them seriously. This battle was not a meeting of equals in formation. It was a negotiation of styles. Urartian infantry, disciplined and equipped with shields, spears, and heavy armor, formed defensive positions. Archers lined the parapets. Chariot teams prepared for counterattacks. Yet the Cimmerians avoided direct confrontation. They circled. They harassed. They advanced, retreated, and advanced again. Their aim was to stretch Urartu's ability to respond, forcing its soldiers into uncomfortable terrain where speed mattered more than fortification. In the end, the engagement likely ended not in decisive victory or defeat, but in a shift of momentum, Urartu realizing that its northern frontier would remain in flux for years to come. As these clashes unfolded, word spread beyond the mountains. To the Assyrians, longtime observers of Urartu, the appearance of the Cimmerians created new strategic possibilities. If Urartu struggled to secure its northern border, Assyria might capitalize on the disruption. Thus, the Cimmerians entered the broader geopolitical imagination as actors, not shadows, a development that would shape their path westward. Greek sources, written much later, speak of the Cimmerians as a frightening force sweeping down from the north. But these stories reflect memory, not immediate reality. The early encounters with Urartu were smaller, more atmospheric, a gradual introduction of a new people into the historical scene. Behind every skirmish and raid were families, herds, and the daily rhythms of steppe life. Even while some warriors tested Urartian defenses, others tended their animals along lower mountain slopes or waited in temporary encampments. Children learned to ride ponies through narrow valleys. Elders told stories by fires built from mountain scrub. The landscape of conflict remained intertwined with the landscape of living. This is an important element of the calming narrative. The Cimmerians were not a roaming army. They were a society, moving in waves. Their presence in Urartu was as much about migration as it was about confrontation. Over time, Urartu adapted. It reinforced certain strongholds, established new watchtowers, and increased patrols in vulnerable areas. These measures did not expel the Cimmerians, but they created a more stable frontier. Cimmerian groups moved westward, some by choice, others nudged by this renewed defensive effort. Urartian records grow quieter after these early clashes, suggesting that the Cimmerians did not seek to destroy the mountain kingdom. Instead, they followed a natural logic of movement, testing edges, redirecting paths, and flowing along the contours of opportunity. Having traversed the Caucasus and tested Urartu's resolve, the Cimmerians gradually shifted their movement. Their eyes turned toward the fertile valleys and wealthy cities of Anatolia, lands less fortified by nature, more accessible to fast-moving riders, and increasingly embroiled in their own political tensions. This westward turn would bring them into contact with Phrygia, Lydia, and eventually the heartlands of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But at this early moment, as they drifted away from the Urartian frontier, the Cimmerians carried with them not triumph or conquest, but experience, the hard-earned wisdom of adapting to mountains, kingdoms, and unfamiliar landscapes. They had entered the written memory of the Near East. Their story would only grow larger from here. What draws a wandering people toward the great cities of distant valleys? This section covers the Cimmerian incursions into Phrygia, Lydia, and neighboring regions. It gently weaves historical accounts with the quiet presence of legendary figures such as King Midas, while keeping the tone grounded and calm. It explores why Anatolia's kingdom struggled to resist fast-moving, highly mobile cavalry forces, and how these raids shaped the region's political landscape. The mountains of the Caucasus opened into the plateaus of eastern Anatolia like a series of descending steppes, high ridges giving way to river valleys, and valleys widening into broad plains. It was into this shifting landscape that the Cimmerians rode during the early 7th century BCE, carrying with them the momentum of a people pushed into motion. Their journey had already left faint marks across the highlands of Urartu, but it was here, in the lands of Phrygia, Lydia, and the small kingdoms that stitched Anatolia together, that their presence would echo through both history and legend. What drew them forward was a blend of necessity and opportunity. Pressed from the east by the Scythians and pulled westward by the wealth of settled kingdoms, the Cimmerians found themselves crossing into a region whose political map was far more complex than the open steppe. Here stood fortified capitals of stone, hilltop citadels, and royal courts that governed trade routes stretching from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. For a people accustomed to horizons, these tightened spaces must have felt both strange and irresistible. The earliest literary whispers come from the Greeks, who viewed Anatolia as a frontier of wonders, kings, and tragic fates. Among these stories stands the figure of Midas, the Phrygian king whose name would eventually be wrapped in myth. While the golden touch belongs to later Greek imagination, the historical Midas was a real ruler, a man who attempted to weave alliances, resist encroaching powers, and stabilize Phrygia during a turbulent age. His kingdom lay directly in the path of the Cimmerians. The Cimmerians did not march like an army. They arrived like a tide, small groups testing borders, scouting river crossings, or slipping through mountain passes, followed by larger clusters of riders, families, and herds. To Anatolian states, these movements often appeared as sudden eruptions. Unlike the armies of Assyria or Urartu, the Cimmerians did not need supply lines or garrison cities. Their mobility was their strength. Horses provided speed, milk, meat, and transport, and their entire material world could be carried across ridges and river basins. To the established kingdoms, this way of life was deeply unfamiliar. When Phrygia first encountered the Cimmerians, its defensive strategies were shaped by a world of fortified towns and slow-moving infantry. They expected threats to come through predictable corridors, routes known for generations. But steppe cavalry did not operate within those boundaries. They could bypass fortifications, avoid direct confrontations, and strike at the edges of kingdoms before vanishing into the uplands. In this way, the Cimmerians moved through central Anatolia, leaving behind traces in both archaeology and later tradition. Burned layers and hilltop sites, disrupted trade, and sudden political realignments. For Phrygia, the impact was severe. Ancient sources speak of attacks so destructive that they became woven into the downfall of King Midas himself. Some traditions suggest that when his kingdom faltered under Cimmerian pressure, Midas took his own life. Whether this is literal truth or a later embellishment, it reflects the sense of crisis that rippled through Anatolia at the time. A powerful kingdom, rich in resources and cultural influence, struggled to withstand a people who fought with mobility and unpredictability rather than siegecraft or territorial conquest. From Phrygia, the Cimmerians pushed farther west and south. The Lydian kingdom, centered at Sardis, emerged as their next major opponent. Lydia, unlike Phrygia, was in the midst of becoming a rising power, wealthy, confident, and tightly governed. Yet even here, the Cimmerian threat proved formidable. Accounts describe multiple incursions, and in one case the death of a Lydian king, Gyges, who fell during a Cimmerian attack around the mid-7th century BCE. His successor, Ardys, would also be forced to confront these northern riders, seeking help from the Assyrians to stabilize the kingdom. These events are not narrated with dramatic battles in the ancient texts. Instead, they appear as sudden shocks, abrupt mentions of towns attacked, kings killed, and cities threatened. This fragmented record reflects not only the nature of Cimmerian warfare but also the challenges faced by states that relied on walls and infantry against enemies who could break contact at will. It was not simply their weapons or numbers that made the Cimmerians formidable. It was the rhythm of their approach. They did not fight to hold land, but to move through it, striking, withdrawing, and returning from unexpected directions. For the Cimmerians themselves, these raids were likely part survival, part opportunity. In a new world of fortified polities and tribute networks, raiding served as both resistance and adaptation. The movement into Anatolia was not a conquest in the imperial sense. It was a continuation of steppe traditions applied to a different environment, gathering resources, asserting presence, and navigating the shifting pressures that had driven them south and west. Archaeology offers quiet glimpses of this period. Steppe-style arrowheads found far from the grasslands, horse gear with distinct steppe ornamentation, and burial sites that blend northern traditions with local influences. These subtle traces form a mosaic, showing that the Cimmerians were not simply invaders. They were participants in the cultural exchanges of the region. Some groups may have settled temporarily, others continued farther west, and still others merged with local populations. In a world defined by mobility, identity was fluid and layered. The Cimmerians also carried stories and beliefs into Anatolia. Their tradition of heroic warriors, their reverence for horses, and their practice of burying important individuals with weapons and ornaments. All of these customs would later blend with the early Scythian world and influence steppe cultures for centuries. In a gentle way, their presence in Anatolia widened the cultural horizon of the region, introducing motifs that would echo even after the Cimmerians themselves faded from history. By the late 7th century BCE, the power of the Cimmerians in Anatolia began to wane. The Lydians adapted to their tactics, strengthening cavalry forces and developing political alliances that made repeated incursions more difficult. The rising strength of neighboring states also created new pressures. In time, the Cimmerians who had once ridden across Anatolia with ease found themselves squeezed between growing regional powers and the lingering presence of Scythians behind them. Yet the memory of their passage endured. Greek writers later viewed the Cimmerians with a mixture of awe and distance. A people who seemed to come from nowhere, move through the world like a storm, and disappear beyond the edges of knowledge. Their raids into Anatolia became part of the broader story of shifting peoples in the early Iron Age, a reminder that the ancient world was never static, but shaped by movement, adaptation, and encounter. For nighttime listeners, this chapter offers the soft rhythm of a wandering people brushing against the settled kingdoms of the Near East. It is a story of contact rather than conquest, of horizons meeting walls, and of cultures adjusting to the unexpected presence of riders from the north. Yet even as they rode through foreign lands, the Cimmerians carried with them a world of beliefs and traditions. What did an ordinary day look like for a people who lived beneath the open sky? The world of the Cimmerians was shaped not by walls or cities, but by the slow turning of seasons and the endless reach of the steppe. Life here was measured in the movement of herds, the shifting of weather, and the long, quiet rhythms of an environment that demanded both resilience and flexibility. To imagine an ordinary day among the Cimmerians is to picture a landscape where the horizon was a companion, not a boundary, and where the routines of survival blended gently into the rituals of community. Their homes were portable worlds, tents or felt-covered structures that could be dismantled, loaded onto wagons or pack animals, and carried across the grasslands. Although no Cimmerian tents survive, comparisons with later steppe cultures give us a soft, reliable picture: round or slightly oval frames of wood, covered in felted wool or stitched hides, anchored by ropes and weighted stones. Inside, the air would have smelled of wool, smoke, and sun-dried grasses. At the center burned a hearth, the glowing heart of the family's space. Around it were blankets, woven bags, small chests, writing tack, and the tools of daily work. Families were the core of Cimmerian society, extended groups bound by kinship, responsibility, and tradition. A typical household moved together, worked together, and shared the tasks of tending to herds, repairing gear, cooking meals, and preparing for seasonal migrations. Women were central to this world. They managed the hearth, maintained clothing and felt coverings, prepared food, milked animals, and oversaw the young. Many steppe societies also relied on women for craftwork, animal care, and often diplomacy between clans. Men guided the herds, hunted when needed, and trained in riding and combat. Though the steppe did not always draw sharp gender divisions, skill often mattered more than role. Children grew up with the rhythm of mobility. From a young age they learned to ride small steppe horses, their hands gripping manes before they ever held a bridle. They watched elders select campsites, prepare winter stores, and read the landscape for changes in pasture or weather. Knowledge was passed not through writing but through observation and stories, quiet teachings carried in the wind. Food on the steppe came from herds, foraging, and occasional trade. Dairy was central. Fermented mare's milk, yogurt-like drinks, cheese curds dried for long journeys. Meat came from sheep, goats, and sometimes horses or cattle, usually boiled or roasted with simple herbs. Grains entered their diet through trade with settled neighbors or through gleaning near river valleys and frontier settlements. Meals were humble, practical, and often shared around the hearth, where warmth and food formed the emotional center of daily life. Their clothing reflected the demands of riding and weather. Wool trousers, leather boots, tunics lined with fur, felt caps or hoods to shield against wind, practical garments adapted to life outdoors. Many items were decorated with simple patterns, geometric shapes, stitch symbols, or small metal ornaments. These were not merely decorations but carried meaning, clan affiliation, identity, or markers of status. Horses were constant companions. Much of each day revolved around their care. Grooming, feeding, checking hooves, repairing tack. Horse gear, bits, reins, saddles were prized objects, crafted with skill and passed down through generations. Riders cared for their horses with a quiet intimacy, understanding that survival depended on an animal's strength, speed, and endurance. Seasonal migration formed the backbone of daily life. In spring, the Cimmerians moved toward greener pastures as herds birthed new foals and lambs. Summer brought wider ranges and longer journeys. In autumn, preparations for winter began. Drying meat, insulating tents, finding sheltered valleys. Winter itself was a season of introspection and closeness, with families gathered near their hearths as storms swept across the plains. Despite the challenges of steppe life, there was beauty woven into each day. Bright mornings when the grass shimmered with frost. Afternoons filled with the sound of grazing animals and children's laughter. Evenings when the flames of a hearth cast soft light on the faces of those gathered inside. The sky, always vast, marked each change. Sunrise in subtle pinks, sunsets that deepened into gold, and nights when stars stretched overhead like an endless map. The Cimmerians, like other steppe peoples, did not see their lives as isolated from the world. They traded with farmers at the edges of the grasslands, exchanged goods with metalworkers, and shared grazing rights with neighboring clans. Their society moved not only through space but through relationships, friendships, alliances, marriages between groups, and agreements negotiated at seasonal gatherings. A day in Cimmerian life involved tasks that were quiet but essential. Mending riding gear, weaving ropes, shaping arrowheads, caring for elders, tending to the sick. These were acts of continuity, connecting one season to the next. The lack of monumental architecture did not mean a lack of culture. Their achievements lay in mobility, craftsmanship, and a deep attunement to the land. As night arrived, families gathered inside their tents. Stories were told. Memories of ancestors, tales of journeys, and accounts of great riders whose courage shaped the identity of the clans. The flickering fire illuminated faces, and the hum of wind outside faded into the soft interior quiet. In these moments, the Cimmerians were not simply wanderers. They were part of a lineage, a living chain of traditions rooted in the movements of the earth. And beyond the rhythms of daily life lay deeper currents, their beliefs, their spirits, their sense of the unseen. In a world defined by the wind and the horizon, where did the sacred reside? For the Cimmerians, the sacred was not confined to temples or carved into stone. It lived in the open world around them, in the sky that stretched unbroken above the grasslands, in the spirits of their ancestors, and in the quiet strength of the animals that sustained their way of life. Their spirituality was woven into daily experience, expressed not through scripture but through practice, memory, and the rhythms of the land. Like many early steppe peoples, they inhabited a universe where the seen and unseen coexisted gently, where every gust of wind and every passing star might carry meaning. At the heart of their belief system were sky deities, figures associated with the vault of heaven, the storms that swept across the plains, and the fiery sun that guided their migrations. While the Cimmerians left no written record of their gods, later Indo-European steppe groups share enough parallels to draw calm, cautious connections. The heavens were often seen as the dwelling place of powerful forces, both protective and unpredictable. A thunderstorm rolling across the steppe might be interpreted not simply as weather, but as a divine presence, a reminder of energies larger than the clans who rode beneath them. The earth, too, carried spiritual weight. The bones of ancestors rested in burial mounds that dotted the landscape, quiet reminders of lineage and continuity. These mounds, sometimes raised with stones or timber, created a bridge between the past and present, a physical link to those who had moved across the land long before. To pass by an ancestral mound was to acknowledge the enduring presence of one's heritage, a recognition that life on the steppe was a continuation of earlier journeys. Animals played a profound role in Cimmerian cosmology. The steppe was alive with creatures adapted to its vastness. Wild horses, wolves, deer, and birds that soared high above grazing herds. Each held symbolic meaning. Hawks or eagles might represent vision and protection, deer could evoke themes of renewal or subtle guidance, and wolves embodied both danger and communal strength. These animals were not objects of worship but companions in the shared environment of the steppe, beings with their own spirits, deserving of respect. Among all creatures, however, the horse stood apart. Its importance in Cimmerian ritual life was immense. The earliest archaeological traces of Cimmerian presence in the Near East include graves where horses were laid to rest beside their riders, signaling a bond that extended beyond life itself. To bury a horse with a warrior was to acknowledge that the two were inseparable partners, in travel, in battle, and in the journey that continued after death. These burials also served as calm discoveries for archaeologists, providing insight into both the social status of individuals and the deep emotional ties between humans and their mounts. Horses were often adorned in life and in death. Bronze bits, decorated cheek pieces, and intricate harness fittings reflect not only craftsmanship but ritual meaning. Their gear frequently bore stylized motifs, swirling patterns, animal heads, or abstract symbols, hints of a worldview that saw beauty and power intertwined. The act of preparing a horse for burial was ceremonial, guided by traditions quietly preserved across generations. Ritual life among the Cimmerians was not centralized. There were no great priesthoods or permanent shrines. Instead, rituals emerged from the common spaces of camp and pasture. Offerings cast into fire, songs performed during migrations, or gestures made at dawn as riders mounted for a long journey. Fire was a recurring symbol, a purifier, a guide, a companion during nights when the wind swept across the tents. Ashes from a hearth were sometimes preserved during seasonal moves, a way of carrying the warmth and spirit of home into new lands. The warrior ethos of the Cimmerians was also deeply entwined with spiritual ideas. To die in battle was not simply a personal end, but a transition into a realm where ancestors and heroic figures existed in continuity. The afterlife envisioned by steppe peoples was not kingdom-like or hierarchical. It resembled an idealized version of the world they knew: open plains, swift horses, and a sense of unending movement. This belief shaped their burial customs. Weapons were placed beside the dead not merely as symbols of status but as practical tools for the next stage of existence. One of the gentlest and most telling aspects of their ritual life was the care taken with the dead. Even when resources were limited or clans moved frequently, there was effort to ensure proper burial arrangements. Graves were aligned with the rising or setting sun, a symbolic gesture linking the departed with the cycle of light. Small objects, beads, knife blades, parts of harnesses, were added to accompany the soul. These items remind modern observers of a quiet truth. Even in cultures built on mobility, the desire to honor the departed was universal. Ceremonies also accompanied major life events: births, marriages, and the forging of alliances between clans. These gatherings were not grand spectacles but intimate affairs rooted in kinship and mutual respect. Music likely played a role: simple instruments carved from bone or wood, the rhythmic beat of drums, or the soft chanting of elders. Such gatherings reinforced cohesion within the confederation of clans that formed the Cimmerian identity. Trade and contact with neighboring peoples introduced new spiritual elements, but the core remained firmly grounded in steppe traditions. Their interactions with the cultures of Urartu, Phrygia, and Assyria exposed them to temple-based rituals and more structured religious systems. Yet the Cimmerians, even as they rode through foreign lands, maintained a worldview shaped by landscape, animals, and ancestral memory. Their spirituality remained portable, adaptable, and deeply personal. A faith carried not in books but in gestures, stories, and the natural world. The horse, above all, continued to serve as a sacred symbol. Its strength allowed families to move across enormous distances. The speed gave warriors an advantage in battle. Its presence shaped the art, the stories, and even the emotional vocabulary of the Cimmerian experience. To understand their spiritual world is to recognize the horse not merely as an animal but as the living heart of their culture. It was a guide, a protector, and sometimes a bridge between the human world and the divine. The horse's breath in the early morning cold, the warmth of its flank during winter travel, the rhythmic sound of hooves striking earth, all carried a quiet spiritual resonance. Across the steppe, under the shifting patterns of stars, Cimmerian families moved through a universe that was alive with meaning. Every fire lit, every saddle placed, every song sung during migration connected them to something larger, an unseen presence that accompanied their journeys. Their faith was not a system but a way of being, rooted in the belief that the world around them was infused with spirit. Yet no belief shaped them more than their relationship with the horse, the living heart of their culture and their warfare. How do you govern a people whose home is wherever their horses carry them? Leadership among the Cimmerians was shaped not by walls, cities, or palaces, but by the wide and shifting expanse of the steppe. In this landscape, authority could not rely on monuments or physical boundaries. It emerged from trust, reputation, and the subtle balance of clan relationships. To guide a nomadic people, a leader needed to embody both strength and humility. A figure who understood the rhythms of migration, the needs of herds, and the quiet signals of the land. Governance was therefore fluid, responsive, and deeply intertwined with mobility. Cimmerian clans were built on extended families, groups that moved together with their tents, animals, and possessions. Within each clan, elders held a respected position, valued for their knowledge of past migrations, old alliances, and the lessons passed down from ancestors. Younger warriors deferred to them not out of rigid obedience, but because wisdom was seen as a vital resource, just as necessary as horses or weapons. Decisions affecting the clan were typically made in open gatherings, where voices were heard and concerns expressed freely. This created a sense of shared responsibility, a collective understanding that survival depended on cooperation. When several clans came together, they formed what scholars sometimes describe as a confederation, a flexible network rather than a fixed political entity. At the head of such a grouping might stand a chief or war leader, chosen for his ability to command respect across multiple lineages. His power was not absolute. It depended on persuasion, reputation, and his talent for forging consensus during times of peace and crisis alike. A leader who failed to listen could find himself quietly sidelined, replaced not through rebellion but through the natural reorganization of allegiances. The Cimmerian concept of leadership was deeply shaped by their style of warfare. In nomadic societies, a leader's authority was often measured by his ability to protect the clan, to guide warriors effectively in battle, and to secure resources during long migrations. A war leader was expected to know the land intimately, to read the curve of the horizon, identify safe pastures, and anticipate the paths of rivals or enemies. Guidance was not only a matter of strategy but of intuition, shaped by a lifetime spent on horseback. In times of conflict, clans gathered for what might be called war councils. These meetings were not ceremonial spectacles but practical gatherings, usually held at dusk or dawn when the steppe was quiet. Leaders discussed the routes they would take, the positions of enemies, and the risks involved. Maps as we know them did not exist. The terrain lived in memory, in stories, and in the experiences of those who had traveled across it many times. Young warriors might listen silently at the edge of the gathering, absorbing the patterns of thought that shaped their people's military decisions. Mounted warfare required adaptability. The Cimmerians were masters of speed, able to cover long distances in a single day, shift direction rapidly, or disappear into a sweep of grasslands before an opponent could react. A leader had to understand how to synchronize riders, how to use the terrain for concealment, and how to time charges with precision. Unlike settled empires with standing armies, the Cimmerians relied on fighters who knew their horses intimately, men who had grown up riding, herding, and living alongside the animals that carried them into combat. Because of this, leadership was often tied to personal skill. A leader had to be an exceptional rider, an archer capable of firing accurately at full gallop, and a person whose judgment inspired confidence. This was not a system where authority came from lineage alone, although noble families existed within the clans. Rather, leadership was continually proven and reaffirmed through action. A strong leader strengthened the confederation. A weak one could lead it into danger. Women also played important roles within the leadership structure, though often expressed through different channels. While men formed the bulk of mounted warriors, women managed domestic decision-making, trade relationships, and the welfare of herds, the foundation of Cimmerian life. Their knowledge shaped clan stability, and their influence guided major choices about migration and alliance. In times of crisis, women contributed to strategic discussions, drawing on their deep understanding of family networks and community needs. One of the calm discoveries about Cimmerian governance lies in its resilience. Because authority was distributed and flexible, the society could adapt quickly to challenges. When pushed by Scythian expansion, the clans reorganized and shifted their routes. When entering Anatolia, they adjusted to new environments, new enemies, and new opportunities. Their leadership system allowed them to survive and respond to pressures without collapsing under the weight of rigid hierarchy. Another gentle insight emerges from the archaeological record. Graves containing noble warriors often show a mix of weaponry, horse gear, and objects from distant lands. These burials suggest individuals who traveled widely, forged alliances, and carried symbols of leadership recognized across clans. These artifacts, discovered centuries later, offer a quiet glimpse into how the Cimmerians honored those who guided them. Warriors followed leaders not because they were commanded, but because they trusted them. Loyalty was personal, rooted in kinship ties and shared experiences. During raids or migrations, leaders rode at the front, demonstrating both courage and responsibility. In return, they relied on their warriors to maintain formation, protect supplies, and respond to signals given with horn blasts or raised banners. This mutual dependence created cohesion in a society that valued independence yet understood the necessity of unity. Leadership also required emotional steadiness. Life on the steppe was unpredictable. Storms, disease, rival tribes, or scarcity of grazing could transform stability into hardship. A leader who remained calm under pressure, who spoke with confidence and considered the concerns of others, could help a clan or confederation navigate uncertainty. Their words carried weight not because they shouted but because they understood the importance of quiet guidance. The Cimmerian system of tribal leadership made their warfare distinctive. Rather than large formations, they favored smaller, coordinated groups capable of rapid maneuvers. Leaders signaled the beginning of an attack, the shift to feigned retreat, or the moment to regroup. Every rider understood his position, and every horse was trained to respond with sensitivity. This harmony between leadership, strategy, and mobility created a form of warfare that bewildered the kingdoms they encountered. For historians, reconstructing Cimmerian leadership involves piecing together references from neighboring cultures. Assyrian sources mention chiefs by name, often describing them with a sense of wary respect. Greek writers, looking back, portrayed the Cimmerians as fierce but not disorganized, a recognition that their confederated leadership produced formidable results. These external observations, though filtered through foreign perspectives, offer valuable glimpses into how Cimmerian leaders were perceived beyond the steppe. Yet leadership among the Cimmerians was not entirely centered on warfare. Peace required as much attention as conflict. Leaders managed grazing rights, settled disputes between families, and organized seasonal movements. They maintained relationships with neighboring tribes and, at times, with settled powers. Hospitality was an important cultural expectation. Leaders represented their clans in encounters with outsiders, ensuring that trade and diplomacy flowed smoothly. In this world, authority resembled the movement of the steppe winds. Shifting, responsive, sometimes quiet, sometimes forceful, but always shaped by the environment. It was a system that reflected the values of a people who lived without walls, those who found foundation not in stone but in connection, movement, and shared responsibility. And in battle, leadership depended on more than authority, it depended on mastery. In the quiet expanse of the early Iron Age steppe, the Cimmerians shaped a way of war that did not rely on walls, towers, or heavy ranks of infantry. Instead, their strength came from motion, from the bow drawn on horseback, from the swift strike and the equally swift disappearance. To understand how a people without cities could influence kingdoms carved in stone, we must look closely at the tools they carried and the strategies they lived by. The composite bow lay at the heart of Cimmerian warfare. Made from horn, wood, and sinew, it was a small weapon with immense power, capable of sending an arrow far beyond the reach of simple wooden bows used by sedentary peoples. Its size made it ideal for use on horseback. A rider could twist at the waist, draw, and release with a smooth motion of practiced familiarity. The bow was not merely a weapon but a companion, held close during travel, repaired with care, and often buried with its owner. Alongside the bow, Cimmerian warriors carried short swords or aconakes, blades designed for close encounters after an initial storm of arrows had disrupted their enemy. These swords were simple yet sturdy, often with leaf-shaped blades and straight, unadorned hilts. They were tools meant for function rather than display. Some warriors also carried small, round shields made of leather over wood, light enough not to hinder their speed yet strong enough to deflect a hurried strike. Armor varied. Many warriors wore little more than layered leather or padded garments reinforced with small bronze plates. Others, especially leaders or those of higher status, may have used early forms of scale armor, flexible, overlapping pieces of metal that moved with the body. Everything was chosen with mobility in mind. Heavy armor slowed the horse and risked the rider's life. Lightness was survival. These tools shaped their tactics. Cimmerian warfare relied on unpredictability, the ability to appear suddenly on the horizon, loose volleys of arrows, and vanish before an enemy could organize. They fought in loose, fluid formations, not rigid ranks. At full speed, riders could circle a slower force, firing inward from all angles. When pressed, they could scatter in every direction, only to recombine moments later beyond the reach of their pursuers. It was a style of combat born from open plains and constant motion. Raiding, too, was central to their strategy. For a nomadic people, resources depended on movement. Herds needed pasture, families needed security, and tribes needed goods not easily found on the steppe. Raiding brought metal, grain, textiles, and horses. Yet these raids were rarely chaotic. They required discipline, coordination, and careful knowledge of the land. Scouts rode far ahead, reading the terrain, noting river crossings, and watching the movements of settled armies. Success depended not on brute force but on judgment, knowing when to strike, when to retreat, and when to ride past a heavily defended settlement in search of a softer target. Survival also required adaptability. The Cimmerians encountered fortified cities, stone walls, and armies trained in rigid formations. They could not meet such forces head-on, but they did not need to. Instead, they attacked supply lines, disrupted communications, and drew defenders into ambushes. Their speed became its own kind of shield. Even when confronted by larger powers, they remained elusive, forcing their enemies to respond to them rather than the other way around. This combination of weapons and tactics allowed the Cimmerians to exert influence far beyond what their population numbers might suggest. A kingdom could spend decades building fortifications, organizing armies, and preparing defenses, only to find that a mounted force could bypass everything in a single night's ride. The steppe horse, the composite bow, the light armor, and the mobile camp were all parts of the same system, a way of life that turned the landscape itself into their strongest ally. And that influence would reach its height during their most dramatic encounters. The world of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was one of stone, clay, and order, cities walled with mud brick, royal palaces carved in relief, and archives stacked with tablets that pressed the thoughts of kings into permanence. It is within these tablets, beneath the soft wedge-shaped script of the scribes, that the Cimmerians first enter clear historical sight. The Assyrians did not discover them through treaties or embassies, but through movement, distant raids along the northern frontier, shifting alliances in the mountain corridors, and sudden appearances in regions that kings believed they controlled. Under Sargon II, the Assyrians were expanding aggressively across the Near East. Their empire reached the Zagros Mountains to the east, the Mediterranean to the west, and the foothills of the Caucasus to the north. Yet beyond those northern hills lay a world difficult to grasp from the vantage point of cities. A world where people lived by the seasons, moved with their herds, and answered to the authority of clan alliances rather than thrones. When Assyrian scouts and messengers first reported the presence of Cimmeri, the Cimmerians, the scribes recorded them not as a kingdom or a defined nation, but as a force, a people in motion drifting across landscapes without fixed borders. The tablets describing these encounters are calm in tone but rich in detail. They speak of raids near the frontier regions of Urartu, of groups offering service to local rulers, and of sudden disruptions in territories the Assyrians had recently claimed. One moment, the records describe tributary states acknowledging Assyria's dominance. The next, they note that northern riders had swept through the same lands, leaving confusion in their wake. The scribes carefully listed these events without embellishment, yet the contrast is unmistakable. An empire built on stability trying to describe a people who considered mobility a form of strength. The geography between the Caucasus and Anatolia shaped these early contacts. Narrow passes, steep gorges, and high plains created natural corridors through which steppe peoples could enter the Near East. Cimmerian groups likely moved in waves rather than a single unified migration, some raiding border towns, others negotiating passage or employment with local kings. To the Assyrians, this patchwork of movement appeared unpredictable. To the Cimmerians, it was simply the landscape of their lives, a terrain of possibilities shaped by opportunity and necessity. When Esarhaddon succeeded the Assyrian throne, the references to the Cimmerians became more frequent and more defined. His reign was marked by numerous threats from the north, and the royal annals describe how he dispatched armies to secure the frontier. Yet even with these efforts, the Assyrians rarely managed to pin the Cimmerians down. Their reports speak of victories gained but rarely of foes destroyed. The riders simply melted beyond the mountains when confronted, only to return in another region months later. For a people accustomed to stone cities and agricultural cycles, this fluidity was difficult to map onto their traditional understanding of enemies. And so the Assyrian view of the Cimmerians oscillated gently between wariness and curiosity. They were neither fully feared nor fully despised. Instead, they were acknowledged as a reality of the borderlands, a presence that had to be accounted for in military planning, treaty negotiations, and the allocation of garrisons. Some tablets even suggest moments of cooperation, where Cimmerian forces served as mercenaries or auxiliaries in regional conflicts. In these instances, the Assyrians saw them less as intruders and more as another thread in the complex web of Near Eastern politics. The most striking part of these records is not the violence they describe, but the calm way they reveal the limitations of imperial knowledge. The Assyrians prided themselves on documentation. Their scribes recorded omens, trade, taxes, and military campaigns with remarkable precision. Yet when describing the Cimmerians, their tone becomes more tentative. They knew where the raids occurred, which local rulers complained, and which garrisons were threatened, but they did not seem to know the rhythms of the people responsible. The Cimmerians left few permanent traces for the empire to grasp. No royal monuments, no stone cities, no archival traditions. Their story had to be pieced together from movement rather than from material remains. This contrast, gentle rather than confrontational, becomes one of the most evocative parts of their shared history. On one side of the frontier stood an empire of carved reliefs, formal campaigns, and rigid maps. On the other side rode a network of clans whose identity shifted with the seasons, whose alliances were flexible, and whose memory lived through oral tradition. When the Assyrians looked north, they saw not chaos, but uncertainty. Riders appearing over horizons, moving with a purpose the empire could not fully categorize. The clay tablets, now resting in museum cases far from the lands where they were inscribed, allow us to trace these patterns. Through their cuneiform lines, we glimpse moments of tension, misunderstanding, and fleeting cooperation. We see how the Cimmerians first entered the written world not through their own words, but through the observations of those who built archives. And in that contrast, the story of two very different civilizations begins to unfold. What does an empire see when it looks toward the horizon and finds riders instead of walls? As Assyria recorded these northern riders in clay, the Cimmerians continued west, toward a land of kings, mountains, and fated encounters. The kingdom of Phrygia, set deep within the highlands of central Anatolia, was a land defined by rhythm and continuity. Its hills rolled gently toward distant horizons, and its capital at Gordion sat at the meeting point of ancient trade routes, where caravans wound slowly between valleys and fortified towns. Under King Midas, this landscape enjoyed a period of prosperity. Fields yielded grain, herds grazed in calm cycles, and artisans worked ivory, bronze, and wood into objects admired across the Near East. To later generations, Midas became a figure of myth, but in life he was a ruler managing a kingdom shaped by practical burdens, treaties, rivalries, and the slow rise and fall of regional influence. By the late 8th century BCE, Phrygia occupied a delicate position. To the east stood Urartu, powerful and ambitious. To the west lay the growing interests of Greek cities along the Aegean. Between them stretched a mosaic of smaller states, tribal groups, and shifting alliances. Phrygia held these competing forces at bay through diplomacy and a strong central court, yet its stability depended on careful balance. Even before the Cimmerians appeared, small tremors of change were already moving through the region. Tensions with neighboring peoples, pressure on trade routes, and the complex dynamics of an expanding Near Eastern world. It was into this landscape of subtle vulnerability that the Cimmerians rode. Their approach was not a single, dramatic invasion, but a series of movements, some exploratory, some opportunistic, as groups pushed south and west from the Caucasus. Classical writers would later wrap these events in layers of legend, describing the fall of Phrygia as sudden and catastrophic. But the archaeological evidence paints a quieter, more textured picture, one defined by shifts in settlement patterns, layers of burned debris, and pottery horizons that drift slowly across the countryside. At Gordion, excavations have revealed a burn layer dating to around this period. Blackened earth, collapsed buildings, and scattered remnants of daily life suggest a destructive event, but not necessarily one that erased the kingdom outright. The city was rebuilt, its people continuing their routines long after the flames cooled. Rather than a single moment of devastation, the evidence suggests a world shaken, not shattered. A capital impacted by raiding groups or political turmoil, then forced to adapt to a new regional reality. The Cimmerians, with their swift cavalry and flexible organization, moved through such vulnerabilities rather than creating them. They did not carry siege engines or armies designed to topple fortified states. Instead, they applied pressure at the edges, raiding outlying towns, disrupting communication between rulers, and inserting themselves into conflicts that were already unfolding. Their presence magnified these stresses, nudging a delicate balance toward collapse. For Phrygia, this pressure coincided with internal instability and shifting alliances. Some regions may have struggled with drought or resource shortages. Others faced tensions with neighboring tribes who sensed opportunity in the kingdom's uncertainty. The appearance of mounted warriors capable of moving faster than Phrygia's traditional defenses only deepened the strain. In this quiet interplay of cause and effect, The figure of King Midas emerges not as a tragic mythic character, but as a ruler navigating circumstances beyond his control. Classical accounts portray him as overwhelmed by disaster, but archaeology invites a more human interpretation. A king managing uncertainties, responding to distant threats, and relying on advisors who could only guess at the intentions of the newcomers from the north. His legacy, wrapped later in stories of golden touch and divine punishment, reflects how ancient memories often blend fact with cautionary tale. The Cimmerians themselves likely saw Phrygia not as a target to be destroyed, but as part of a wider landscape of opportunity. Their mobility allowed them to strike quickly and disappear just as swiftly, returning to the open territories where neither walls nor political boundaries constrained them. To settled kingdoms, this movement seemed unpredictable. To the riders, it was simply the natural way of life on the steppe, translated into the hills and valleys of Anatolia. As various groups passed through or around Phrygia, some may have clashed with local garrisons. Others may have negotiated passage or seized livestock and supplies. Archaeology suggests periods of abandonment in some settlements, small but telling indications of communities that chose to relocate rather than face recurring threats. Yet these movements were part of a broader pattern across the region, not solely the result of Cimmerian action. The late 8th century was a time of transition, marked by shifting powers and changing frontiers. In this wider context, the fall of Phrygia becomes a story of gradual unraveling rather than sudden ruin. The kingdom did not vanish overnight. Its culture persisted, its people adapted, and elements of its material traditions continued to influence the region for generations. What changed was the political landscape. The authority of the central kingdom weakened, its boundaries blurred, and its position within the wider Near Eastern world altered irrevocably. Through calm reflection, one can see how the mythic memory of Midas and the historical movement of the Cimmerians intersect. Later storytellers shaped Midas into a symbol of excess and downfall, but the archaeological record reveals a kingdom navigating the same uncertainties that shaped many ancient states. Shifting alliances, environmental pressures, and the arrival of new peoples seeking space and opportunity. The Cimmerians became part of this changing world, participating in a process that had already begun long before their arrival. Today, the quiet soil around Gordion offers subtle reminders of that era. Charred beams, scattered pottery, traces of hurried abandonment. Each fragment contributes to a narrative that is both grounded and uncertain. The absence of written Phrygian accounts from this period heightens the mystery, leaving historians to weave together evidence from Assyrian annals, classical recollections, and archaeological layers. In this weaving, the Cimmerians appear less as destroyers and more as catalysts, their presence amplifying stresses that were already present. How does a kingdom built on tradition endure when the world begins to move around it? From the ruins of Phrygia, the Cimmerian tide continued west, toward the rising strength of Lydia. What happens when a city built on stone faces an enemy shaped by motion? The question lingers quietly over the fertile valleys of western Anatolia, where the citadel of Sardis rose on its commanding ridge. From this vantage point, one could see the surrounding plains, the winding river, and the network of roads connecting the city to its hinterlands. Sardis was a city of walls and careful planning, a seat of kings whose authority rested on fortifications, infantry, and the weight of tradition. Yet the horizon beyond these prepared defenses held a different kind of force. Riders whose lives had been shaped by open landscapes, shifting alliances, and a culture of movement. The Cimmerians approached Lydia not as a single mass but in swift detachments, moving across the terrain with intimate knowledge of horse and path. The fertile valleys offered sustenance and grazing, but also opportunities to flank, to bypass fortifications, and to strike at the city's weaker perimeters. For centuries, Lydian strategy had relied on standing armies and fortified gates, yet against steppe cavalry, these measures proved difficult to enforce. The riders' advantage lay in speed, coordination, and the ability to strike unpredictably, concepts that the defenders, trained in linear formations, could not easily counter. King Gyges, the Lydian ruler, occupies a measured space in this story. Not merely a figure of legend, He was a pragmatic monarch balancing ambition with instability. Aware of the threat from the north, he sought alliances and counsel, including support from the Assyrians, yet his resources were constrained. Sardis, though impressive in stone and timber, was only as strong as the networks of soldiers and subjects who manned its walls. The Cimmerians, in their light armor and mounted formation, were able to exploit the gaps left by these very constraints. Their movements were guided by experience, reconnaissance, and an understanding of the terrain, rather than by sheer force. Archaeology provides gentle confirmation of these events. Excavations in Sardis reveal burn layers and collapsed structures corresponding to the late 8th century BCE, subtle traces of conflict that align with textual sources. Rather than focusing on dramatic destruction, these layers tell of disruption. A temporary upheaval that challenged the city's authority, altered trade, and forced adaptations in urban planning. The evidence suggests that the Cimmerians struck quickly, creating strategic dislocation and then withdrawing, leaving the city to regroup and continue its life with resilience. The siege and eventual capture of Sardis illustrate a quiet but profound contrast between nomadic and sedentary societies. The city relied on permanence, walls, granaries, and structured defenses. The Cimmerians relied on motion, scouts, mounted archers, and flexible formations. The encounter reveals not a battle of overwhelming carnage, but a meeting of two worlds, one rooted in stone, the other in speed. Observers can imagine riders gliding over the ridges and river crossings, striking at outlying gates, and then dispersing as the defenders attempted to respond, like wind bending but not breaking the grass. In the aftermath, Lydia adjusted. The fall of Sardis was not permanent annihilation. Rather, it marked a period of instability that reshaped political networks. New strategies emerged. Fortified towns were reinforced, alliances with neighboring powers strengthened, and attention to mobile threats increased. Yet the memory of the Cimmerians' presence lingered, recorded in chronicles and later mythic traditions, shaping how the region viewed northern riders for generations to come. Their influence, while significant, was temporal, a phase in a longer story of Anatolian history that would see the rise of new kingdoms and the continued evolution of military strategy. One gentle discovery in this chapter of history is the way in which mobility redefined influence. The Cimmerians did not require vast numbers to make an impact. Instead, their knowledge of terrain, coordination across clans, and mastery of horses allowed them to challenge the structural advantages of cities like Sardis. Observers, both ancient and modern, can recognize that success did not come from overwhelming force alone but from a nuanced understanding of movement, timing, and adaptability. Another insight emerges in the figure of Gyges himself. He was not overwhelmed by incompetence or poor leadership, but by circumstances beyond the control of a single king. Internal pressures, regional rivalries, and the sudden arrival of a highly mobile adversary created conditions in which traditional defenses were insufficient. By framing the event in this way, the story moves from legend into measured history, allowing listeners to perceive the balance between human decision-making and broader historical forces. Finally, the quiet interplay between Cimmerian strategy and Lydian response underscores a broader pattern in the history of steppe civilizations. Mobility, adaptability, and decentralized leadership could challenge, disrupt, and reshape settled states without permanent occupation or extensive destruction. It is a story told in layers of soil, in small changes to urban planning, and in the surviving records of scribes who watched unfamiliar riders approach from distant horizons. These traces invite reflection. The power of motion, the limits of fixed authority, and the delicate tension between settled order and the freedom of the steppe. And yet, even at the height of these clashes, the Cimmerians' presence in Anatolia represented only one phase of their long journey. The horizon remained open, their people continued to move beyond walls and rivers, and their story extended far beyond the fertile valleys of Lydia. Carried on the backs of horses, through mountain passes, and into the pages of history yet to be written. What does it mean for a wandering people to reach their greatest influence far from their ancestral home? For the Cimmerians, it was less a story of conquest and more a testament to presence, movement, and subtle authority. Across eastern and central Anatolia, the steppe riders had established a sphere of influence that was felt rather than fixed, a network of seasonal raids, tributary relationships, and shifting alliances that allowed them to shape events without building cities or fortresses of their own. Their power was measured in knowledge of the land, the ability to appear at unexpected moments, and the respect or cautious deference of rulers who could neither predict nor easily restrain them. At the heart of this influence were the rhythms of the steppe translated into Anatolian terrain. Cimmerian groups traveled with their herds and families, moving through fertile valleys during the warmer months and retreating toward higher, safer ground as seasons changed. In some areas, they temporarily settled, establishing camps that bore the traces of domestic and martial life. Simple dwellings, corrals for horses, and caches of metalwork and weaponry. These settlements were never permanent, but they left impressions that archaeologists now detect in layers of soil, in carefully placed arrowheads, and in decorative metal items whose styles echo steppe traditions. The Cimmerians were also integrated into the political landscape as a practical force. Some served as mercenaries for local kings, their horses and bows providing unmatched mobility in conflicts where foot soldiers could not keep pace. Others enforced their own authority, raiding strategically, negotiating tribute, or influencing local decisions through presence alone. Unlike sedentary empires, they did not rely on monumental architecture or bureaucratic oversight to project power. Their influence was fluid, adaptive, and quietly pervasive. Material culture provides a window into this world. Horseback, carefully designed with both function and subtle ornamentation, reveals the centrality of the mount in daily life and strategy. Composite bows, arrowheads of bronze and iron, and protective gear demonstrate the balance between mobility and effectiveness. Decorative metalwork, belt fittings, pins, and ornaments, hints at aesthetic sensibilities carried from the steppe into Anatolian contexts. These artifacts, dispersed across sites from Phrygia to the Upper Tigris, trace the movement of people and ideas rather than a formal empire. Within this sphere, the Cimmerians demonstrated a remarkable adaptability. They moved in response to opportunity, threat, and environment, negotiating with some communities while avoiding others. They respected the limits of territory they could influence, and they rarely attempted to occupy settled lands permanently. Instead, they built a reputation based on the certainty of their presence and the unpredictability of their movements, a paradoxical combination that left enduring impressions on rulers, scribes, and local populations alike. Even at the height of their reach, life for the Cimmerians retained its quiet rhythms. Families continued seasonal migrations, herds grazed under open skies, and the long days of travel allowed time for storytelling, ritual, and repair of tools and weapons. These routines created cohesion among the clans, instilling a sense of identity that was stronger than any single king's decree. Their influence, therefore, was as much cultural as it was political. It spread through the observation of their ways, the adaptation of local practices, and the subtle imprint of steppe habits across Anatolian lands. An observer might notice that, unlike other civilizations whose power is inscribed in stone, the Cimmerian footprint is recorded in objects and movements. Arrowheads found far from the northern steppe, worn horse bits discovered near Anatolian settlements, and personal ornaments buried with the dead all signal the quiet spread of influence. Each item tells a story not of subjugation but of presence, negotiation, and the subtle assertion of authority across a landscape where permanence was rare and adaptability essential. Through these gentle presences, the Cimmerians maintained a balance of power. They did not always wage open conflict. Sometimes their authority was asserted through demonstration of mobility, reputation, and strategic placement. Local rulers understood the limits of their own control, adjusting tribute, forming temporary alliances, or calling on neighboring powers for support. The Cimmerians, in turn, moved on, leaving behind communities shaped subtly by their passage, their methods, and the knowledge that the horizon always held riders ready to arrive without warning. One calm discovery lies in observing how power can exist without fixed borders. The Cimmerians remind us that influence does not always require conquest or occupation. It can be measured in relationships, in movement, and in the respect or caution elicited by a consistent yet mobile presence. Their greatest strength was not in overwhelming numbers or permanent fortifications, but in the quiet mastery of timing, terrain, and the abilities of their horses and warriors. Another subtle insight is the integration of steppe material culture into Anatolian contexts. By studying horse gear, weaponry, and metalwork, we can trace not only movement but also adaptation. The Cimmerians modified their techniques for new environments, adjusted camp practices for fertile valleys, and interacted with local populations in ways that influenced local traditions. This cultural footprint endures, not in the form of monuments, but in the objects, practices, and memories they left behind. And yet, even in moments of strength, the seeds of change often begin to take root. New powers were emerging, local states were learning to respond to mobile threats, and the complex network of alliances that allowed the Cimmerians to project influence began to shift. Their dominance in Anatolia, impressive as it was, depended on conditions that would eventually evolve, on alliances that could break, on rivalries that could intensify, and on the emergence of new military and political strategies among the settled kingdoms. The height of their influence, then, can be viewed as a period of quiet achievement rather than dramatic conquest. It was a time when movement itself became authority, when presence carried weight, and when decentralized coordination shaped the balance of power across regions far from the steppe. Listeners may imagine the Cimmerian clans riding through valleys, crossing rivers, and pausing in temporary settlements, their world expanding across Anatolia not through walls and armies but through the careful, deliberate use of speed, observation, and reputation. This is the story of a people whose reach was measured not in acres, but in the space between horizons, in the ability to appear where others least expected, and in the subtle, enduring traces they left upon the lands they traversed. It is a story of influence without permanence, authority without bureaucracy, and a cultural footprint as wide as it is ephemeral. How does a people defined by motion hold power in a world that demands stability? The question hangs quietly over the rolling hills and fertile valleys of Anatolia, where the Cimmerians had, for a time, established a gentle yet firm presence. Their influence, remarkable in scope, was never anchored in cities or enduring bureaucracy. Instead, it depended on seasonal migrations, the flexibility of tribal networks, and the careful calibration of raids, alliances, and tribute. In this delicate balance lay both strength and vulnerability, for the same qualities that allowed rapid expansion also limited long-term control. Geography, subtle and unyielding, set its boundaries. Mountain ridges, deep rivers, and narrow passes shaped the paths along which the Cimmerians could move. While these landscapes offered avenues for mobility, they also constrained sustained operations, particularly as distances increased from the northern homelands. Temporary settlements in fertile valleys provided respite, but such encampments could not anchor power indefinitely. Over time, the practical challenges of feeding herds, maintaining communication across scattered clans, and negotiating with local populations began to test the limits of their influence. Rival states also played a quiet but persistent role. The Lydians, Phrygians, and remnants of Urartu adapted to Cimmerian presence, learning to anticipate movement and respond more effectively. Political structures, though initially slow to react, gradually developed counter-strategies. Fortified towns were reinforced, alliances were consolidated, and regional diplomacy became more sophisticated. The Cimmerians, accustomed to the rhythms of the steppe, encountered an environment where human systems evolved to meet their unique methods. The interplay was subtle, almost natural, like wind shaping dunes over time, rather than a sudden clash of armies. Within the steppe itself, tribal fragmentation added another layer of limitation. The Cimmerians were a confederation of clans, united by culture and shared practices, yet decentralized by design. Decisions often required consensus or negotiation among leaders, and coordination over long distances could falter. This structure allowed flexibility and resilience but made sustained occupation and administration difficult. Influence was strongest when mobility was preserved, yet the very mobility that granted them advantage also prevented the solidification of authority over distant territories. Perhaps most consequential was the gradual return of the Scythians from the east. These riders, familiar in ways that mirrored the Cimmerians' own traditions, brought renewed competition to the Pontic steppe. Like the movement of seasons across open grasslands, their arrival shifted the balance, pushing some Cimmerian groups westward and forcing recalibration of alliances and raiding patterns. The northern homeland, which had nurtured them, now became a contested landscape, reminding the Cimmerians that dominance was never absolute, only relative, and always subject to change. Archaeological evidence echoes this subtle transition. Layers of material culture reveal periods of continued activity in Anatolia interspersed with signs of withdrawal or relocation. Weapon types evolve, camps shift, and artifacts suggest adaptation to changing circumstances rather than outright conquest or collapse. These patterns illustrate the fluidity of their power. Influence was exerted, adjusted, and eventually curtailed, not through dramatic defeat, but through a quiet reshaping of regional dynamics. Even at their peak, the Cimmerians faced the inherent tension between movement and permanence. Their methods excelled in projection of power over vast spaces without centralized control, yet they were ill-suited to sustaining authority over fixed settlements or managing long-term governance. Seasonal rhythms dictated the flow of their people, herds, and campaigns. Political and military pressures from neighboring states tested their adaptability. And as new riders emerged from familiar lands to the east, the very foundations of their northern strategy began to shift. This period illustrates a subtle truth about nomadic power. It is inherently transient. Unlike empires founded on walls, granaries, and archives, the Cimmerians relied on relationships, mobility, and the perception of capability. Their influence spread through reputation, presence, and timing rather than infrastructure or legislation. It could wax and wane, expand and contract, and yet remain significant in the shaping of regional history. The rise of competing powers did not erase their accomplishments. It merely redirected the flow of their movement, a natural evolution rather than abrupt reversal. In contemplating this gentle ebb, one discovers a lesson in adaptability. The Cimmerians' power was measured not in permanence but in the effectiveness of response. How clans coordinated, how leaders interpreted the land, and how the people navigated uncertainty with quiet skill. Influence existed in moments of appearance and withdrawal, in the awareness of neighboring states, and in the subtle imprint left on culture, trade, and warfare. In this way, their zenith is as much about strategy and foresight as it is about physical presence. Another calm discovery lies in the coexistence of strength and limitation. The same qualities that allowed the Cimmerians to dominate temporarily mobility, decentralized leadership, and intimate knowledge of terrain, also define the boundaries of their reach. Unlike sedentary powers, whose influence is mapped in stone, the Cimmerians' achievements are measured in the shifts of human behavior, the distribution of artifacts, and the memory carried through generations. Their legacy is visible not as a monument, but as the quiet, lasting echo of a people whose rhythm shaped the lands they traversed. Even as their sphere of influence began to recede in certain regions, the Cimmerians continued to adapt. Some clans moved farther west, interacting with Lydia and Phrygia in new ways. Others returned toward the northern steppe, re-establishing seasonal patterns and connections with emerging groups. These movements reflect an enduring principle of steppe life. Power is sustained through flexibility, not fixity. It is carried on the back of horses, through negotiation, and across horizons rather than imposed in permanence. The gradual shift in power, like the slow change of seasons over rolling grasslands, does not diminish the significance of the Cimmerians' presence. They had altered the political, cultural, and military landscapes of Anatolia. They had demonstrated that a decentralized, mobile people could shape kingdoms, influence diplomacy, and leave enduring traces in material culture. Yet, in the same movement that gave them strength, they carried the inevitability of transition, a gentle reminder that no zenith lasts indefinitely. And from the east, Familiar riders were once again approaching, changing the Cimmerians' fate. The Scythians would move across the Pontic steppe in ways that would redirect migrations, alliances, and influence, signaling a new phase in the story of northern riders. The quiet ebb of Cimmerian authority was part of the natural rhythm of the steppe, a transition marked not by dramatic collapse, but by the subtle reshaping of a world in motion. What happens when yesterday's pursuers become today's unstoppable tide? Across the sweeping plains of Eurasia, the rhythm of the steppe carried new forces westward. The Scythians, once a distant presence pressing against the Cimmerians from the east, now advanced with steady purpose. Their return was not marked by sudden chaos, but by the slow, inevitable movement of a people whose lives, like the Cimmerians, were governed by mobility, seasonal cycles, and deep knowledge of the grasslands. The landscape itself, rolling hills, wide rivers, and open horizons, bore silent witness to the subtle shifts of power that would reshape the northern riders' world. For the Cimmerians, the Scythian advance represented both challenge and continuity. These were not unfamiliar enemies, but kindred peoples, sharing the techniques of mounted warfare, composite bows, and pastoral lifeways. Their spiritual practices, veneration of horses, and clan structures echoed the traditions the Cimmerians had long carried from the Pontic steppe. In this sense, the encounter was not merely military. It was cultural, an interaction of two systems of life that had evolved along parallel trajectories. The difference lay in timing, numbers, and strategy, in how opportunity and adaptation were wielded across open lands. Archaeology gently traces this transition. Burial sites in the steppe show the movement of Scythian styles into territories once dominated by Cimmerians. Arrowheads, horse fittings, and ornaments reflect continuity and change, hinting at exchanges, skirmishes, and perhaps temporary alliances. Unlike the sedentary states of Anatolia, these nomadic peoples left no cities to burn or walls to breach. Their presence is felt in subtle traces, the rearrangement of cemeteries, the patterns of settlements abandoned or reoccupied, and the spread of characteristic weapon types. Each artifact is a quiet footprint, a signal of motion rather than occupation. The Scythians' westward sweep also reveals the strategic adaptability that characterized steppe cultures. They moved in detachments, exploiting terrain, rivers, and seasonal corridors, negotiating with local populations where beneficial and engaging in conflict when necessary. For the Cimmerians, who had long relied on similar methods, this shift required recalibration. Clans dispersed, some retreating toward Anatolia, others moving back to northern pastures, seeking refuge in mobility and the alliances they could muster with local rulers or fellow nomads. The ebb of influence was not abrupt. It resembled the gradual realignment of grasslands under shifting winds, quiet, inevitable, and continuous. The narrative of this period emphasizes interconnectedness rather than confrontation. The Cimmerians and Scythians shared technological innovations, such as composite bows designed for accuracy on horseback, and the tactical knowledge of coordinating swift raids across wide spaces. These parallels meant that interactions were layered. Some were competitive, some cooperative, and others likely ceremonial or symbolic. The steppe, vast and open, allowed for movement without constant collision, yet also created conditions in which relative influence could change rapidly with shifts in resources, alliances, or seasonal patterns. Material culture once again tells a quiet story. Steppe cemeteries reveal a mix of styles, Cimmerian pottery forms alongside Scythian weapon types, and horse burials that bear both ritualistic similarities and subtle innovations. These artifacts suggest that knowledge and practice were exchanged even amid pressure and displacement. One can imagine clans observing each other across river crossings, noting methods of harnessing horses, and adapting to survive without the need for written instruction. It is a story of continuity, adaptation, and the resilience of mobile societies. For the Cimmerians, the westward advance of the Scythians gradually curtailed their dominance in Anatolia. Tributary arrangements weakened, seasonal raids became less predictable, and alliances had to be reconsidered. Yet they did not vanish. They adapted. Some groups integrated with local populations, offering services as mercenaries or negotiating temporary settlements. Others retreated along familiar corridors, preserving their traditions and maintaining autonomy where possible. Influence contracted, but knowledge, skill, and cultural identity endured, carried by the movement of people and horses rather than anchored in stone. This period illustrates the inherent balance and limits of nomadic power. Mobility enables rapid expansion, but sustaining influence across diverse regions requires constant adaptation. Geography, competition, and clan structures define the possibilities, while the movements of kindred cultures, such as the Scythians, naturally reshape the landscape of power. Observing these patterns offers a contemplative perspective. History is not only marked by conquest, but by flows, adjustments, and the subtle interactions of peoples whose lives are inseparable from the land they traverse. Another gentle insight emerges in considering the nature of displacement and continuity. Though the Cimmerian sphere of influence receded, their cultural practices and material heritage persisted. Horse-based warfare, composite bows, and ritual observances remained integral to the clan's identity. In many ways, the advance of the Scythians served as a mirror, reflecting the resilience and adaptability that had long enabled Cimmerian society to thrive across unpredictable landscapes. Their history continued not in large cities or monumental archives, but in patterns of movement, memory, and material traces. Even as their presence in Anatolia waned, the Cimmerians retained autonomy in portions of the Pontic steppe. Seasonal migrations continued, clans maintained cohesion, and the knowledge passed through generations ensured that their lifeways would survive. The Scythian pressure, rather than annihilating them, prompted a recalibration, a return to the rhythms of the steppe, where influence was measured not in territorial control, but in the capacity to move, adapt, and endure. And so, as the Scythians swept westward, the Cimmerians sought refuge in familiar strategies: mobility, alliances, and resilience. Their story demonstrates that decline need not be abrupt or violent. Instead, it can be a quiet transition, a shift of influence across landscapes and generations. Just as the wind reshapes the grasses without destroying them, the movements of steppe peoples realigned power and presence, leaving traces that scholars now uncover, in artifacts, in settlement patterns, and in the echoes of oral traditions. By observing this gradual shift, listeners may gain a sense of the broader rhythm of steppe life: expansion and contraction, displacement and adaptation, continuity and transformation. The story of the Cimmerians during the Scythian return is not one of failure, but of endurance. It reminds us that influence is fleeting, yet knowledge, culture, and identity can persist across centuries, carried silently by the people who inhabit the lands between horizons. And so, the Cimmerians, once rulers of a wide-reaching sphere in Anatolia, began a quiet retreat, guided by the movements of horses, the council of clan elders, and the enduring strategies that had allowed them to thrive. Their presence, though diminished, continued to shape local politics, trade, and military practices, leaving a subtle imprint that would influence the next chapter of the Pontic steppe and beyond. When a people stops being recorded, do they truly vanish, or do they simply continue in ways we can no longer trace? For the Cimmerians, the answer lies in subtlety rather than drama. After centuries of mobility, raids, and influence stretching from the Pontic steppe into Anatolia, the records of their presence grow fainter. The decline was neither sudden nor catastrophic. It was a quiet dispersal, a gradual folding of a once visible culture back into the broader tapestry of Eurasia. Some clans merged with Scythian confederations, adopting new alliances and ways of life, while others integrated into local Anatolian communities or smaller tribal networks. Their influence diminished, but their presence endured in forms less visible to the historian's eye. Archaeological traces capture fragments of this process. Camps once occupied by Cimmerian riders show signs of abandonment or repurposing. Burial practices blend with local customs, indicating integration rather than violent eradication. Weapons and ornaments that once marked a distinct identity appear less frequently, yet hints of style and technique persist in neighboring cultures. In this way, the fading of the Cimmerians from written records is mirrored by the gentle diffusion of their material and cultural legacy. History records their departures, but the landscape and artifacts suggest continuity through adaptation. The dispersal also followed the rhythms of steppe life. Groups migrated toward safer pastures or sought alliances that promised stability. Seasonal patterns dictated movement as always, but now under new pressures and new neighbors. Some Cimmerian bands took refuge farther west in Anatolia, quietly assimilating into the social fabric of the regions they had once raided or influenced. Others retreated toward the Pontic and Caucasian steppes, maintaining autonomy in small pockets while adopting elements of emerging Scythian structures. In each case, the culture of mobility and horse-centered life endured, even as political dominance waned. This period reminds us that decline is not always violent or immediate. The Cimmerians did not disappear overnight. Their fading was part of a natural historical rhythm. Empires rise, migrations shift, and the horizon of human activity constantly changes. In reflecting on this, listeners can appreciate the continuity that persists beyond the visible record. Skills, stories, and practices transmitted quietly, leaving subtle but lasting marks on neighboring peoples. Their legacy was woven into the living landscape, much as grasses bend and sway without losing their essence. Cultural echoes of the Cimmerians persisted in Anatolia long after the last recorded raids. Horse-based military tactics influenced local armies, and artifacts such as arrowheads, belt fittings, and horse trappings hint at the continuation of steppe knowledge. In some regions, oral traditions and folklore may have preserved faint memory of northern riders, blending Cimmerian experiences with local myth and history. Even without a written voice, their story continued in human behavior, strategy, and material culture. In this sense, disappearance from the historical record does not equate to cultural extinction. The dispersal also exemplifies resilience. Clans maintained internal cohesion, ensuring that skills, stories, and practices were transmitted even as external pressures mounted. While large-scale political power receded, smaller communities preserved the essence of Cimmerian identity: horsemanship, pastoral knowledge, seasonal migration, and social customs. This quiet persistence allowed fragments of Cimmerian culture to survive within broader Eurasian patterns, demonstrating that the strength of a people is not solely measured by territory or conquest, but by adaptability and continuity. Geopolitical pressures shaped the final chapters of their story. The consolidation of Lydia under new leadership, the expansion of Scythian influence across the steppe, and the rising presence of other Anatolian powers created an environment in which large-scale raids or prolonged influence became increasingly unsustainable. Clans responded with pragmatism rather than defiance. Dispersal, integration, and alliance became the strategies of survival. Their fading from prominence was a reflection of shifting circumstances rather than failure, a calm adaptation to a changing world. One can imagine Cimmerian riders moving quietly through Anatolian valleys, their herds grazing in abandoned fields, their tents scattered among local settlements. They negotiated passage, exchanged goods, and subtly influenced the regions they traversed. These were not dramatic battles or conquests, but the soft imprint of a people adjusting to new realities. The landscape itself carries the memory of their presence. In modified river crossings, reused encampments, and traces of material culture that hint at continuity beneath transformation. Even in decline, the Cimmerians retained elements of spiritual and social life. Horse rituals, clan ceremonies, and oral traditions persisted in smaller circles. Elders taught younger generations the stories of migrations, the skills of mounted combat, and the careful observation of weather and terrain. Life went on, rhythmically and quietly, as it had for centuries, reminding us that culture often survives through adaptation rather than formal preservation. The gentle dispersal of the Cimmerians offers a broader reflection on the patterns of history. Peoples emerge, grow, transform, and sometimes fade from prominence, yet the echoes of their existence linger in subtle, often overlooked ways. The Cimmerian story illustrates that disappearance from written sources does not signify absence. Rather, it reflects a shift from public to private memory, from empire to community, from visible dominance to enduring influence in quiet forms. Archaeologists and historians reconstruct these patterns with care, interpreting material culture, settlement shifts, and the faint traces left in foreign chronicles. Each piece of evidence is a whisper from the past, allowing modern listeners to sense the presence of a people whose world was defined by horses, movement, and adaptability. Through these fragments, we understand not just the decline of the Cimmerians, but the resilience and subtle persistence that characterize many nomadic cultures. And so, as their presence faded from the battlefield and the political maps of Anatolia, the Cimmerians found a new life, not in power, but in memory. Their story continued in the skills they passed on, in the alliances they formed, and in the material traces they left across landscapes they had once traversed with quiet authority. History records them less frequently, but the patterns of human life, cultural adaptation, and survival ensure that their legacy remains embedded in the lands and peoples they touched. This period, then, is not a story of abrupt endings, but of gentle transitions. It is a reminder that civilizations, like rivers and seasons, follow natural rhythms. The Cimmerians' decline was the soft reshaping of a once prominent people, a movement into integration and dispersion, rather than sudden erasure. Their memory endures, in artifacts, in traditions, and in the quiet reflection of those who study their traces. Through this calm narrative, listeners are invited to appreciate the continuity of human experience. The Cimmerians, though absent from chronicles, persisted in form and influence in ways that were adaptive, resilient, and enduring. Their journey across the steppe, into Anatolia, and finally into subtle dispersal provides a contemplative lens on the nature of history. Emergence, movement, transformation, and quiet continuity. A cycle repeated across centuries and continents. And so, as their presence faded from the battlefield, the Cimmerians found a new life, carried forward not by conquest or empire, but by the memory of their movement, their culture, and the quiet yet enduring mark they left on the world. The horizon they once rode under continued to witness human endeavor, and through its open skies, the echoes of their journeys still lingered, soft, persistent, and quietly immortal. How does a people evolve into an idea, a soft symbol of the world's distant edges? Long after the Cimmerians had faded from Anatolia and the Pontic steppe, Greek writers preserved their memory not through precise chronicles, but through poetic imagination. To Homer, Herodotus, and later geographers, the Cimmerians became inhabitants of a shadowed, fog-bound land at the northern limits of the known world. They were less a concrete people and more a reflection of remoteness, a symbol of places beyond the horizon where light barely touched and the ordinary rhythms of life seemed suspended. In the Odyssey, echoes of northern riders appear as distant shadows, described in vague imagery and enveloped in mist, reinforcing the sense that the Cimmerians occupied a world apart from settled Greek life. Herodotus, centuries later, provides accounts that blend careful observation with inherited legend. He situates the Cimmerians north of the Black Sea, noting their raids into Anatolia, yet frames them within a landscape of uncertainty and the unknown. These narratives do not focus on battles or politics in the meticulous way of Assyrian annals. Rather, they capture the emotional resonance of a people whose mobility and foreignness made them enigmatic. This symbolic portrayal was reinforced by geography as understood by the Greeks. Mountains, rivers, and the expanse of the steppe contributed to the impression of a distant, shadowed realm. The Black Sea itself became a liminal space, a frontier where reality and imagination blurred. The Cimmerians, once real riders on horses, were now inhabitants of a mental map marked by mystery, twilight, and distance. They were always out there, at the edge of perception, reminding Greek audiences of the vast, unsettled spaces beyond the cities, harbors, and cultivated valleys they knew. Yet within these poetic renderings lies a subtle continuity of memory. Greek writers preserved the Cimmerians' essence. Their mobility, their incursions into Anatolia, and the perception of them as a force that moved unpredictably across open lands. Through metaphor and narrative, the Greeks captured the cultural impact of northern riders, translating historical presence into literary resonance. The Cimmerians became a lens through which Greek society could explore ideas of remoteness, impermanence, and the tension between the familiar and the unknown. Archaeology and comparative history suggest that these literary images were rooted in kernels of truth. The fog-bound lands of Greek imagination reflect the real northern landscapes of the Pontic steppe, while the depictions of raiding and movement echo the Cimmerians' historical activity in Anatolia. The Greeks, consciously or unconsciously, preserved fragments of Cimmerian lifeways, translating them into symbols that resonated culturally long after the steppe clans had dispersed. Their words carried memory, shaping perceptions of northern peoples for centuries to come. The symbolic Cimmerians also served as a canvas for reflection on human experience. In literature, they represent the limits of knowledge, the edge of the civilized world, and the transient nature of power and presence. For Greek audiences, imagining a people living perpetually at twilight, distant and unknowable, encouraged contemplation of the fragility of empires, the uncertainty of the horizon, and the flow of history beyond immediate perception. In this sense, the Cimmerians transcended the historical and became a medium for philosophical reflection, quietly influencing thought and imagination. Through these literary echoes, the Cimmerian story extends beyond the concrete events of raids, migrations, or battles. They exist in the liminal spaces between fact and myth, geography and narrative, history and imagination. Their cultural presence lingers in metaphors, in descriptions of distant lands, and in the soft, evocative images of twilight, fog, and northern horizons. Listeners can sense the continuity of a people whose memory outlived political structures, carried forward in the stories, symbols, and reflections of those who encountered or imagined them. And from these poetic images rose legends that traveled far beyond the Cimmerians' historical life. Their transformation from living riders to figures of literary and symbolic imagination illustrates the quiet persistence of human memory. Even when a people moves from power into dispersal, when their presence fades from the battlefield and the archives, traces endure in perception, in language, and in the imagination. The Greeks preserved not only what the Cimmerians did, but how they felt to those who watched from the margins. A distant, fleeting, and enigmatic presence that stirred wonder without need for dramatization. Through this gentle lens, listeners are invited to consider history as a living continuum. Peoples, like ideas, move through time in ways that are sometimes visible, sometimes subtle, and sometimes intangible. The Cimmerians' journey into Greek thought is a testament to the enduring influence of cultural memory, showing that even when political power diminishes, influence can persist in perception, shaping understanding, narrative, and imagination long after the last horse has ridden across the steppe. In this quiet transformation, the Cimmerians' presence becomes both historical and reflective. A people remembered as much through what they inspired in others as through what they themselves built or destroyed. The steppe, the mountains, and the valleys of Anatolia remain touched by their passage, and the Greek imagination preserves them in twilight and fog, in the liminal spaces where history and story intertwine. They continue to exist, softly, in the mind as symbols of movement, remoteness, and the mysterious reaches beyond the known world. Echoes that invite contemplation and calm reflection, fitting for the tranquil journey of nighttime listening. When history slips into legend, what truths remain softly embedded within the stories? For the Cimmerians, this gentle transformation began soon after their presence faded from the chronicles of Anatolia and the Pontic steppe. In Greek literature, Homer and later writers associated them with fog-bound lands, shadows, and twilight, images that suggest not only distance, but the boundary between life and death. They became inhabitants of spaces that were as much metaphorical as geographical, a people whose real-world migrations and raids had been absorbed into the imagination of storytellers. In this quiet blending of memory and narrative, the historical Cimmerians shifted into figures of legend, traveling across time and culture long after the last horse had ridden across the steppe. Beyond Greece, Traces of their legacy appear in the medieval period, woven into place names and oral traditions along the Black Sea coast. Villages, valleys, and rivers preserve faint echoes of their name and movement, hinting at the enduring awareness of northern riders who once passed through these lands. Folk stories, often told by candlelight or beside hearths, remembered them not as invaders or conquerors, but as distant, almost mystical presences, carriers of knowledge, symbols of mobility, and embodiments of the unknown. Their legendary status was not born of fear or awe alone, but of continuity. Fragments of identity persisting in human consciousness even when political or social structures had vanished. Archaeology and textual study together illustrate this soft persistence. Pottery styles, burial practices, and metalwork, once distinctly Cimmerian, were adapted into neighboring cultures, leaving subtle traces of influence. These objects, scattered across Anatolia and the steppes, echo the people who created them, even as their societal structures dissolved. Just as the Greeks imagined them at the edges of the known world, the material record preserves a quieter reality. A civilization that did not disappear abruptly, but gradually merged with others, leaving fragments that scholars can now piece together with care. In literature and folklore alike, the Cimmerians became symbols of remoteness, of horizons that stretch beyond the ordinary eye. Tales of twilight lands, of shadowed riders, and of northern peoples surviving at the margins of the known world carried lessons about adaptability, endurance, and the impermanence of human constructs. They remind us that the essence of a culture can survive even when its political or military power has faded, traveling through stories, objects, and memory, softening the edges of history without losing substance entirely. This gentle process is not unique to the Cimmerians, but it illustrates a universal rhythm of human experience. Civilizations emerge, expand, influence, and eventually fade from immediate view, yet their echoes remain, subtly shaping the imagination, geography, and material culture of those who follow. In the Cimmerians' case, the interplay of historical record and poetic memory demonstrates how the tangible and intangible combine, allowing a people to persist in consciousness long after their direct presence has ended. And so, with both history and legend told, we return to the final, quiet reflections. The Cimmerians, once riders of the open steppe, participants in the tides of Anatolian politics, and keepers of pastoral and martial knowledge, now exist in memory as much as in fact. Their journeys, their culture, and their adaptations endure, not in the sharp clarity of chronicles alone, but in the soft persistence of stories, symbols, and artifacts that quietly echo through time. What remains of a people whose greatest monument was the open sky? The Cimmerians left few cities, few fortifications, and few written records. Yet their influence endures in quieter, subtler forms, woven into the cultures, technologies, and memories of the peoples who followed. Across the Eurasian steppe and into Anatolia, echoes of their horsemanship, tactical innovations, and material culture ripple through history, often blending seamlessly with other traditions. They remind us that not all legacies are monumental. Some are carried gently forward in practice, skill, and imagination. Mounted warfare, for instance, continued to define steppe societies long after the Cimmerians faded from view. Their techniques, rapid mobility, coordinated cavalry strikes, and archery on horseback, became part of the repertoire of Scythians, Sarmatians, and later nomadic groups. These practices were not preserved in manuals or inscriptions, but transmitted through observation, imitation, and the careful training of young riders. In this way, the lessons of the Cimmerian steppe passed from one generation to the next, shaping the strategies of peoples who may have known little of their origins, yet inherited the rhythm of movement, coordination, and endurance that had long defined Cimmerian life. Material culture also reveals subtle threads of continuity. Horse tack, bridles, saddles, and decorative metalwork reflect technical knowledge that spread across regions, influencing neighboring tribes and even settled communities. Arrowheads, swords, and ornaments adapted into local styles preserve traces of aesthetic and functional choices first refined on the Pontic steppe. Each artifact is a whisper from the past, a quiet reminder that influence need not be monumental to be lasting. These physical remnants suggest a civilization whose impact was integrated into the fabric of Eurasian life, rather than etched into stone. Even in social and cultural practices, the Cimmerians left echoes. Clan-based organization, seasonal migrations, and pastoral routines were absorbed into neighboring communities, shaping local approaches to kinship, herding, and mobility. Shared traditions of horsemanship, oral storytelling, and ritualized warfare persisted in forms adapted to new contexts. Though their name faded from records, aspects of Cimmerian life lived on in the lived experience of those who followed, reinforcing the continuity of steppe culture across centuries and landscapes. Language and place names, too, offer subtle markers of influence. The Cimmerians' presence along the Black Sea and in Anatolia left traces in geographic terminology, which endured in medieval and even modern references. These echoes, though faint, act as gentle bridges between past and present, reminding us that human movement, memory, and interaction often leave their mark in ways that outlast political dominion or military success. In listening closely, one can perceive the quiet persistence of a people whose direct presence may have ended, but whose traces continue in familiar rhythms of speech and memory. Genetic and demographic blending further illustrates their quiet legacy. As Cimmerian groups integrated with Scythians, Anatolian communities, and other steppe peoples, their genes and cultural traits became part of the broader mosaic of Eurasian populations. This blending was neither abrupt nor violent. It was a natural consequence of mobility, alliances, and survival. Over time, it produced societies shaped in part by Cimmerian experience, an enduring influence that is visible not in monuments, but in the continuity of human life across space and generations. In reflecting on these enduring traces, it becomes clear that the Cimmerians' legacy is best understood as part of a long continuum. They were neither the sole inventors of mounted warfare nor the only drivers of steppe culture, yet they contributed essential rhythms, techniques, and perspectives that persisted long after their decline. Their story reminds us that influence is often cumulative, interwoven, and gentle, a quiet shaping of human practice rather than a dramatic imprint on stone or scroll. Even memory itself carries their presence. As we have seen in Greek imagination and later folklore, the Cimmerians became symbols of remoteness, movement, and twilight. These images endure alongside material and cultural legacies, offering a multi-layered testament to a people who existed both in reality and in imagination. Their narrative shows that civilizations can persist in memory as effectively as in physical artifacts, and that the soft impressions of a culture can travel far across time and space. This reflection also emphasizes the inherent humility of historical influence. Not every society leaves behind a pyramid, palace, or monumental archive. Some leave lessons in adaptation, patterns of mobility, and the quiet knowledge of surviving on shifting landscapes. The Cimmerians' open sky, their rhythm of migration, their horsemanship and communal ties. These were their enduring monuments, subtle yet persistent, shaping the trajectory of steppe history and influencing neighboring peoples in ways that continue to resonate. And with these gentle remnants acknowledged, the story of the Cimmerians approaches its final, peaceful close. Their journey across the steppe into Anatolia, and finally into legend, demonstrates the quiet continuity of human experience. The skills they honed, the practices they transmitted, and the images they inspired became part of the living landscape, reminding us that history is as much about subtle persistence as it is about conquest or empire. In the end, the Cimmerians' legacy is found not in the grandeur of walls or the permanence of records, but in the enduring rhythms of life, culture, and memory. Their influence lives quietly in horsemanship, in patterns of migration, in the melding of peoples, and in the stories passed from one generation to the next. It is a legacy measured not in monuments, but in continuity, in the persistent hum of human adaptation, ingenuity, and reflection across the open steppe. As night falls over the grasslands they once roamed, one can imagine their riders moving beneath the horizon, their presence now dispersed yet quietly embedded in every valley, river, and road that later travelers would follow. The wind carries faint echoes of hoofbeats, the whisper of past lives, and the continuity of traditions that ripple gently through time. In listening to the calm rhythm of history, we sense the enduring heartbeat of a people who lived beneath the sky, whose greatest monuments were motion, memory, and quiet influence. When we listen closely to the winds of the steppe, can we still hear the distant hoofbeats of those who rode before us? The Cimmerians, first whispers in the grasslands of the Pontic steppe, moved across vast landscapes that shaped every aspect of their lives. Rolling plains stretched endlessly beneath the sky, offering both freedom and challenge, while harsh winters tested resilience and ingenuity. Their world was defined not by walls or cities, but by the horizon itself, the rhythm of migration, and the cycles of herd and season. In this quiet contemplation, we can trace the paths they followed, imagining riders silhouetted against dawn, their figures fleeting yet indelibly present in memory. Through the passes of the Caucasus, they journeyed southward, navigating rugged terrain that demanded skill, courage, and intimate knowledge of mountains and valleys. These corridors were not merely obstacles, but pathways of opportunity, avenues into Anatolia and lands of fertile river valleys. The rivers themselves guided movement, their waters reflecting the sky and marking routes where people and horses alike could find sustenance. Along these paths, Cimmerians met other cultures, engaged in fleeting alliances, and left traces in the artifacts and burial practices that survive to this day. Their story, though now faint, remains woven into the landscape like a subtle echo of past life. In Anatolia, the steppe riders encountered kingdoms and fortified cities, lands of stone, commerce, and established rule. Yet they did not linger to build lasting empires. Their strength lay in motion, in adaptability, in the capacity to appear and vanish as the winds dictated. Raids, alliances, and temporary settlements allowed them to influence distant realms, while remaining fundamentally tied to the rhythms of the open land. Here, their presence is both tangible and elusive, remembered in historical accounts, hinted at in archaeological evidence, and preserved in the faint resonance of myth and legend. The Cimmerians' passage through these valleys demonstrates the delicate balance between mobility and impact, showing how a people shaped by motion can leave enduring impressions without permanence. Beyond military encounters, the Cimmerians carried with them the subtle currents of culture. Oral traditions, ritual practices, reverence for horses, and patterns of kinship and social organization. These practices flowed outward, influencing neighboring societies in ways both immediate and gentle. They remind us that culture is transmitted not only through conquest or governance, but through observation, adaptation, and the quiet rhythms of daily life. Even as individual clans dispersed or merged with other groups, elements of Cimmerian experience traveled forward, blending into the broader tapestry of Eurasian human activity. Their story, while ending as a distinct entity, continues in these quiet, ongoing legacies. We may imagine, too, the deeper dimensions of their world, the spiritual and reflective spaces they inhabited beneath endless skies. The wind over the steppe, the rhythm of hooves, the gaze upon distant mountains, all were part of a landscape that shaped thought, belief, and ritual. The horse was more than a companion or tool. It was central to identity, to mobility, and to the sacred. Sky gods, animal symbolism, and warrior rites echoed the steppe itself, turning the natural environment into a canvas of meaning. In this way, the Cimmerians' experience reminds us that human life is inseparable from the landscapes it inhabits, and that culture is as much a reflection of geography as of social or political structures. Time, as it does for all nomadic peoples, gradually carried them beyond the historical record. Groups were absorbed into Scythian confederations, Anatolian settlements, or neighboring tribal networks. Others persisted in small communities, retaining fragments of identity that eventually merged with new contexts. This dispersal was neither abrupt nor tragic. It was a quiet fading, a gentle dissolution that mirrors natural cycles. Just as the seasons reshape the grasslands, so too did history reshape the Cimmerians' presence. They did not vanish so much as transform, leaving traces in memory, myth, and material culture. Echoes that attentive listeners can still perceive today. Their legacy, then, is one of quiet influence. It is found in the techniques of mounted warfare passed to successive steppe peoples, in the subtle diffusion of material culture across Eurasia, in the stories and metaphors preserved in Greek thought and later folklore. It is present in rhythms of migration, patterns of kinship, and the delicate interplay between mobility and environment. Though they did not erect monumental edifices, their impact is discernible in the ongoing human relationship with open landscapes, horses, and movement. Their story teaches that the most enduring monuments may be subtle, embedded in practice, memory, and the natural world itself. As we contemplate these gentle traces, it is worth imagining the quiet moments of Cimmerian life. Dawns over frost-tipped grass, evenings spent tending herds, the distant horizon glowing in sunset, and riders pausing to watch the wind play across valleys. These were the lived experiences of people who shaped the world not through permanence, but through rhythm, adaptation, and observation. Their lives were intertwined with the land, and their influence, though indirect, was deeply felt across time and space. In this, there is both beauty and solace, the recognition that history is composed not only of grand events, but of enduring patterns of life and subtle currents of culture. Finally, as we follow the imaginary paths they traveled, we see that history itself is a kind of horizon, vast, shifting, and often beyond complete view. The Cimmerians remind us that human experience is shaped by movement, interaction, and reflection, and that influence can persist even when documentation is sparse or fragmentary. By listening attentively, we can trace the outlines of vanished societies, feel the cadence of horses across open plains, and sense the rhythms that sustained lives centuries ago. In this attentive observation, we participate in the continuity of human memory, connecting past and present in a calm, reflective manner. A final breath, a final horizon, and the memory of a people carried quietly into the night. The steppe, the mountains, and the river valleys remain, softly shaped by those who moved through them long ago. The Cimmerian story, once one of emergence, growth, and dispersal, now rests in reflection, a testament to endurance, subtle influence, and the beauty of lives intertwined with open landscapes. For the listener, this gentle journey leaves a sense of closure, an awareness of human persistence, the passage of cultures, and the quiet wonder of civilizations that lived beneath the sky, leaving legacies not of stone or scroll, but of motion, memory, and enduring presence. If you've journeyed with us across the open steppe, through mountain passes, and into the river valleys of ancient Anatolia, consider staying with us a little longer. Subscribe to Nightfall History for more peaceful explorations of civilizations that shaped our world, from the whispered beginnings of forgotten peoples to the enduring echoes of empires. Turn on notifications to join future journeys into lost worlds, tribal cultures, and the quiet corners of history, all told in a calm, immersive voice designed to soothe, educate, and inspire reflection. And if you wish, share this voyage with others who appreciate slow, thoughtful storytelling, where every hoofbeat, horizon, and artifact carries a story waiting to be remembered. Settle back, close your eyes, and let history whisper you gently into the night.